The radio crackled once, then went silent. 11 men were trapped in a canyon with no cover left and a rocket crew taking aim from above. Commander Victor Hayes had spent the last 3 days telling anyone who would listen that Sergeant Emma Carter didn't belong on this mountain. She was too quiet, too green, too much of a political favor wearing a uniform. Now, with smoke pouring from 2 destroyed vehicles and his best operators pinned behind rubble that wouldn't hold another 30 seconds, Hayes pressed the radio with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. She was the only option left, and she already had the shot. If this story finds you wherever you are, follow my channel, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The cold came in stages up here. First it found the gaps in your collar. Then it settled into the joints, knuckles, knees, the hinge of your jaw. By the time it reached bone, most people had already made noise about it, shifting weight, muttering under breath, pulling at gear that had been fitted correctly for hours. Small movements that said, "I'm not built for this." Sergeant Emma Carter hadn't moved in 41 minutes. She lay prone on a granite ledge 12 meters above the convoy's planned route. Her body melted into the rock the way ice melts into stone, slowly, completely, without complaint. Her cheek rested against the cold polymer of the rifle stock. Her breathing had settled into a rhythm that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite wakefulness, something in between. A state she'd learned to find the hard way, over thousands of hours on ranges and rooftops and hillsides, where no one was watching and no one cared how long she held still. The Blackstone Highlands did not care either. They were indifferent in the way only mountains could be. Vast, gray, magnificent, in their complete lack of interest in the living things crawling across them. The wind came in from the northwest in long, uneven pulses. Emma had been reading it for the better part of an hour. She knew its pattern, the way you know the pattern of someone's breathing in the dark. Not through thought, through attention. Below, the convoy was staging. 3 armored vehicles, 12 personnel total, designated Team Phantom on the mission roster. Their objective was a remote weapons cache confirmed by Signals Intelligence 2 days prior. A compound tucked behind the second ridgeline, accessible only through a narrow canyon passage the locals called the Throat. The name was not metaphorical. The canyon walls rose 60 feet on either side, compressed the wind into something almost physical, and funneled anything that moved directly beneath the elevated positions on both flanks. Emma had flagged those positions in her pre-mission reconnaissance report. The report had been acknowledged with a single line of text. Noted. Proceed per original route plan. She hadn't argued. Arguing wasn't the job. The job was to be ready for whatever gap opened between what commanders planned and what terrain actually allowed. And up here, in the Blackstones, terrain had a habit of opening very large gaps very fast. The convoy commander, Victor Hayes, stood beside the lead vehicle with a radio handset pressed to his ear, and a look on his face that communicated, without words, that he was a man who had already decided how this morning was going to go. Hayes was not a bad soldier. He was experienced, decorated, and confident in ways that had served him well for most of his career. He was also the kind of man who had learned to trust his instincts so completely that he'd stopped double-checking them. Emma had worked with men like Hayes before. She understood them the way you understand weather. Not fondly, not with resentment, but practically. Understanding them didn't make it easier to be under their command. She watched him through the scope, not aiming, just observing. He moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd done this enough times that it had become automatic. He was good at command. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, even in her own head. What he wasn't good at, what he had never once demonstrated in the 3 weeks she'd been attached to his team, was updating the picture when new information didn't fit the frame he'd already built. That was the thing that was going to matter today. She'd gotten the assignment 3 weeks ago. The notification had come through channels, officially, like any other administrative transfer. Sergeant Emma Carter, attached to the 114th Special Operations Reconnaissance Unit, was to report for integration with Team Phantom for a series of Highland operations beginning the following Monday. The posting was a result of a force restructuring order that had pushed several smaller units into consolidated task force arrangements. The language of the memo was dry and procedural. It conveyed nothing of what had actually happened to the 114th. What had actually happened to the 114th was something she still hadn't been fully briefed on. Budget review was the official version. There'd been investigations, plural, that had run quietly through the unit's last deployment and produced conclusions that were classified above her clearance level. Most of her people had scattered. A few had transferred to administrative assignments. One had left service entirely and wasn't responding to messages. Emma had received this posting because someone with enough stars on their collar had decided the task force needed a designated precision shooter, and Emma's service record, clean, thorough, 15 confirmed long-range engagements across 2 previous deployments, 0 fratricide incidents, 0 friendly casualties attributable to her work, had landed her name at the top of a list. She hadn't asked for it. She'd reported as ordered. Hayes had made his position clear within 48 hours of her arrival on Iron Ridge Base. It happened in the motor pool on a Tuesday afternoon, gray sky threatening rain that hadn't arrived yet. She'd been carrying her rifle case toward the cleaning station, walking past the cluster of vehicles where Hayes was reviewing equipment manifests with 2 of his senior operators, Sergeant First Class Dale Morrow and Staff Sergeant Owen Price. She'd caught the edge of their conversation without meaning to. Morrow had said something she didn't fully catch, something about the force restructuring order. Hayes had responded with a short, dismissive laugh that she recognized before she heard the words that followed. Political placement. Hayes's voice, relaxed and certain. Someone upstairs needed a checkbox filled and Carter's file was convenient. We'll keep her on the perimeter, give her a clean sector, and make sure she doesn't create a problem. She hadn't stopped walking. She'd kept her pace exactly the same, set her case down at the cleaning station, opened it with the latches she'd been opening for 6 years, and begun the breakdown. Suppressor first, then the bolt carrier group, then the barrel, swabbed with the methodical care that had become as automatic as breathing. Her hands were steady. That was the thing people misunderstood about moments like that one. They assumed the right response was anger or hurt, or the particular kind of tightening in the chest that came from being reduced to someone else's convenience. And maybe those things were there, somewhere below the surface. But the surface was very still. The surface had learned to be still a long time ago, in a situation much worse than a commander's dismissive assessment in a motor pool. She'd noted it, filed it, and returned to the barrel, which needed one more pass with the cleaning rod before it was right. The first mission brief had been 2 days later, in a prefab operations room on the east side of the base that smelled like stale coffee and the particular chemical tang of dry erase markers used on a surface that had been written on too many times. The team was present in full, 12 operators including Emma, seated around a central table with the mission map spread across it. Hayes ran the brief himself. It was, she had to admit, a competent brief. He walked the team through the canyon approach, the target compound's confirmed layout, the expected resistance profile based on SIGINT assessments, the extraction windows, and the contingency routing if the primary path became untenable. Clean lines, reasonable assumptions. He knew how to brief, and his team knew how to listen. She had waited until he finished before she raised her hand. The approach leaves 3 natural overwatch positions unaddressed, she said. 2 on the east wall of the canyon, 1 on the west. The eastern positions have unobstructed line of sight on approximately 40 meters of the convoy route. That's the section between the entrance and the first bend. If any of those positions are occupied, we lose vehicle mobility before we reach the turn. The room had been quiet in the way rooms get when something uncomfortable has been introduced into a conversation that was going well. Morrow looked at Hayes. Price was studying the map with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not dismissive, not convinced, something in between. A few of the other operators were looking at her with the careful neutrality of people who hadn't yet decided what to think. Those positions are outside the assessed threat concentration, Hayes said, without particular hostility. His voice carried the weight of a man managing a meeting that he considered mostly finished. SIGINT puts activity concentrated at the compound itself. The elevated terrain in the approach zone has been assessed as unoccupied. SIGINT assessed from what position? Emma asked. A pause, shorter than it looked. Aerial and electronic collection, Hayes said. Aerial won't catch a static position if they've been there long enough, and they're disciplined about cover, and electronic collection misses couriers entirely if they're traveling clean. She kept her voice level. This wasn't a challenge. It was information. The distinction mattered. I ran a ground survey from the south approach 2 days ago. The angles on the eastern positions weren't clean from that survey point, but the geometry is there. I'd want eyes on those positions before we commit the convoy to that route. The route stands on current assessment, Hayes said. He was patient about it. That was the thing. He was never rude to her in the briefing room. He was simply, completely certain. The SIGINT picture is consistent. We proceed as planned. She had nodded. Understood. She'd written the positions in her notebook that night. Grid coordinates, elevation estimates, the angles she'd calculated from the survey. She'd written them carefully, with the precise handwriting that didn't change even when her hands were cold, and she'd sat with the notebook for a long time after the writing was done, thinking about what she was going to do if those positions were occupied when the convoy rolled. The answer was, what she could, with what she had, from where she was placed. That was always the answer. 41 minutes prone on the ledge had become 53. The convoy had finished its comms check. She'd heard her own call sign, Wraith, in the radio sequence, and had keyed twice in acknowledgement. No words required. Her position was set, rifle on the bipod, angled down the slope toward the canyon mouth, scope adjusted for the low, flat light of early morning in the highlands. The sky was the color of old pewter. The first suggestion of dawn was behind the eastern ridge. Not visible yet, just a slight, grudging increase in the gray. Morrow's voice came through the earpiece, clear and professional. Wraith, Phantom-led element. We're moving to stage Alpha. Your sector is eastern wall and route approach only. Confirm. Eastern wall and route approach only. Wraith confirms, she said. She heard the convoy begin to move. The low diesel sound of the lead vehicle, the crunch of tires on frost-hard ground, the small radio exchanges between operators as they fell into their movement positions. The throat waited ahead of them, its walls rising in the gray light like something patient. She was looking at the eastern wall. The first position she'd flagged was empty. She'd checked it 4 times in the last hour. Rock and shadow and nothing else. The second position, there. A shadow shift. Half a second, maybe less, and then absolute stillness. The wind was from the northwest, which meant it wasn't moving debris in that direction. It couldn't be. She brought the scope up carefully, letting her eye settle into the eyepiece with the slow focus that required patience more than anything else. The detail emerged in stages. Rock, shadow, the edge of something that was the wrong shape for granite. 2 figures. Low. Still. Dressed in layers that broke their outline against the rock face. Someone had taught them how to be still. Not soldiers, probably, in the conventional sense, but not amateurs either. They knew what they were doing, and the second one was bracing something against the rock. She keyed the radio. Phantom Wraith. Possible contacts at secondary eastern position grid. She gave the coordinates from the notebook, the ones she'd written 2 nights ago. I have 2 individuals, possible heavy weapon. Request clearance to... Wraith? Negative. Hayes's voice, controlled, certain. That position has been assessed. You're reading rock formation and shadow. Maintain your designated sector. Commander, I have 2 individuals at that position. The second is bracing what looks like Wraith. Sharper now. Not hostile. Definitive. Maintain your sector. The click of the channel closing was very clean and very final. Emma lowered her eye back to the scope. The 2 figures at the secondary eastern position were still there, still motionless, still doing exactly what people do when they are very good at waiting. The wind moved through the canyon below and didn't move them at all. The convoy entered the throat at 0531. She was watching the eastern wall when the lead vehicle hit the IED. The blast was directional, a shape charge. She assessed instantly from the pattern, designed to lift and disable rather than destroy outright. The lead vehicle lurched sideways, front end dropping, and came to a stop at an angle that blocked the canyon entrance for anything coming behind it. The second vehicle braked hard. The third held position outside the canyon. In the 2 seconds of smoke and disorientation that followed, the eastern wall opened up, not from either of the positions she'd surveyed. From a third position, higher and more recessed, one that was only visible from due west, an angle her pre-mission survey hadn't covered because she'd approached from the south, and the fold in the rock had concealed it entirely. Later she would understand that whoever had prepared this position had understood the survey angles and chosen the site accordingly. Later. Right now there was no time for anything except the immediate geometry of the problem. 3 shooters. Elevated. Fire coming down at steep angles into the convoy. Angles specifically chosen because they defeated the armored protection on the vehicle tops, which was thinner than the side armor. Someone had planned this. Contact east! Contact east! Morrow's voice on the radio, clipped and exact. She already had the first shooter. He was behind a granite parapet with only his shoulder and upper weapon visible at this range and angle. 612 meters. Wind from the northwest, 4 miles per hour. Steady. She was prone, stable. Blood pressure almost certainly lower than it should have been for a person in this situation. The math assembled itself below the level of thought, in the trained architecture of thousands of repetitions. She fired. The shoulder behind the parapet disappeared and didn't return. She moved immediately to the second position, reading the incoming fire pattern. Frequency, angle, the slight delay that told her which shooter was the more active and therefore the more acute threat. Second shooter, 72 meters left of the first, 3 meters lower in elevation. 638 meters. She fired. The fire from that position stopped. The third shooter, she'd identified him in the half-second between acquiring and engaging the second, had gone lateral, retreating to a secondary position she couldn't see from her current angle. She tracked him as far as the terrain allowed and lost him behind a fold in the north wall. She keyed the radio immediately. Phantom Wraith 2 confirmed down on east wall. Third element has gone to ground behind north fold. No current eyes. Recommend element closest to vehicle 1. Brake left to reduce angle exposure. Morrow was already moving when he acknowledged. Good. He was a good operator. Whatever he thought of her, he trusted good information when it came at the right moment. Below, the team was doing what trained people do in an ambush, moving, communicating, collapsing the geometry of the threat rather than absorbing it. She could hear it in the radio traffic. Clean and fast. Professional. But she was already back on the secondary eastern position, because the 2 figures she'd reported were still there. And the second figure was no longer bracing something against the rock in a way that suggested getting ready. He was bracing it in a way that suggested about to fire. The smoke from the IED had drifted east on the wind shift. A natural drift. Inevitable, given the change in air current she'd tracked 40 minutes ago. It was reducing visibility in the canyon floor, which was bad for the operators on foot. But it was also bouncing light off the canyon walls in a way that changed the visibility profile of the elevated positions. The secondary eastern alcove was now lit by the diffuse orange-red backscatter from a smoke grenade one of the operators had thrown. She could see the launcher clearly. Rocket-propelled, tube-launched, braced on a bipod mount with a stabilizing grip. She couldn't see the warhead from this angle, but she didn't need to. She could see the direction of aim. Center vehicle. Hayes was in the center vehicle. She already knew what she was going to do. The problem was the radio, which she keyed for precisely 1 second. Phantom, RPG, team at secondary eastern position. Launcher is up. Targeting center vehicle. I have the shot. Request immediate clearance to engage. 3 seconds. 3 seconds is not a long time unless you're watching a rocket launcher reach its firing position, in which case 3 seconds is exactly how much time you don't have. Then Hayes's voice came through, and the thing that struck her even then, even in that moment, was the quality of it. It wasn't the voice of a man in command of a situation. It was the voice of a man who had caught up to a situation that had passed his assumptions 2 minutes ago and was now making the only decision available. Wraith, you are cleared to engage, she breathed out. 620 meters. Wind had shifted to north-northwest in the last 4 minutes. She'd been tracking it, logging the shift in the way her mind cataloged everything that changed in the environment around her. The smoke was moving differently now. The light on the eastern wall had changed. The angle on the launcher had changed as the shooter completed his setup. Every variable that could change had changed. Every variable that hadn't changed was still inside the calculations she'd been running since she first identified the position. She was not thinking about the 11 people in the canyon below. She was not thinking about Hayes or Morrow or the disabled lead vehicle or what happened if this shot missed. She was thinking about the wind at this exact moment, the ballistic drop over this exact distance, the precise point in space where a bullet leaving her barrel at this instant would be when it arrived at that position. She was thinking about nothing else. She fired. The first round struck the launcher's support assembly at the junction between the tube and the grip brace. She hadn't aimed for the warhead. A warhead detonating against a canyon wall at this proximity to the convoy floor would have created its own catastrophe. She'd aimed for the structural integrity of the weapon itself, the point where its balance depended on mechanical connection. A shot that broke the launcher rather than detonated it. A shot that required her to know something specific about the construction of that particular system, which she knew because she had spent the better part of 3 months before this deployment reading technical manuals that no one had asked her to read. The launcher dropped. One of the two figures scrambled immediately. Retreat movement, she assessed, not repositioning for a secondary weapon. The other wasn't moving. She tracked the retreating figure for as long as the terrain allowed, assessed his movement direction and the absence of any secondary firing position along that route, and made the decision not to fire. She keyed the radio. Phantom, Wraith, RPG element neutralized. Second individual retreating north, no secondary position in his route. Not pursuing. A pause that lasted longer than the tactical situation required. Then Morrow's voice, and it was different from how it had sounded 3 minutes ago. Not different in anything he said, just in the texture of it, the way a person's voice changes when they're recalibrating. Copy, Wraith. Good copy. Then Hayes on the open channel, which he almost never used for anything except command traffic. Wraith? A pause. Just the one word first, like he was making sure she was listening. Good shooting. She didn't respond. She was already back on the North Fold, scanning for the third shooter who'd disappeared 20 minutes ago. The engagement wasn't finished because the most visible threat had been neutralized. The engagement was finished when she was certain the team could move without a threat she hadn't identified, and she wasn't certain of that yet. The North Fold stayed still. At 0551, Hayes called all clear. She held position for another 9 minutes after the all clear, because 9 minutes was how long it took her to be satisfied that the North Fold was genuinely empty and not occupied by someone with the discipline to remain motionless through the entire engagement. A spotter. A backup element. Someone waiting for exactly this moment. The team consolidating after the threat was called off, attention dropping, security posture beginning to relax. The North Fold stayed empty. At 600, she broke down her setup. Bipod folded, scope covers on. The rifle went into the drag bag with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done it in the dark, in the rain, in environments where speed mattered more than comfort. She moved off the ledge carefully, taking the same route down she'd used to establish her position. Same footholds, same handholds, no improvisation on terrain she hadn't checked. At the base of the ledge, she paused, looked back up at the ridge, and then looked at the canyon entrance. The disabled lead vehicle was being assessed. She could see 2 operators working around the front end, checking the drive components. Morrow was organizing the accountability check, his voice carrying up the slope in clear cadenced fragments. Hayes was standing near the center vehicle, radio in hand, working the higher command net. He didn't look up. She noted that, filed it alongside everything else. The debrief was at Iron Ridge Base at 10:30 hours, the same prefab operations room, the same dry erase smell. The 2 operators from the lead vehicle, Santos and Webb, were cleared from medical evaluation with minor concussion assessments, which under the circumstances was a very good outcome. They were present at the debrief, Santos with a bandage above his left eyebrow that he kept touching without appearing to notice he was doing it. Morrow ran the engagement review, which was standard. He went through the sequence in order, i.e. de-detonation, initial contact, suppression and movement, the RPG position and its neutralization. He asked Emma to walk through her engagement decisions one at a time, which she did with the same methodical clarity she used for everything. Range, conditions, target assessment, shot selection, the decision not to fire on the retreating individual. Morrow asked good questions. He was not warm about it, but he was fair, and she respected fair more than warm. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Hayes cleared his throat. The secondary eastern position, he said. His voice was even. She had the impression he'd been thinking about how to say this since the all clear. That was in Sergeant Carter's pre-mission reconnaissance report. Nobody spoke. Route planning proceeded on SIGINT assessment, which did not account for a static, well-covered position at that grid. That's a planning gap. He looked at the map, not at anyone in particular. "It'll be documented in the mission report. I'll own it." Price said, "The IED changes the threat assessment independent of the Overwatch positions. That wasn't in anyone's pre-mission picture." "No," Hayes said, "it wasn't. But the Overwatch positions were in one person's picture, and that assessment was set aside." A pause. "That won't happen again." He finally looked at Emma. Direct this time. Not apologetic, she didn't need his apology, and she suspected he knew that. Just direct. "The RPG call saved the element," he said. "That's in the record." She met his eyes. "I'd been watching that position for a while, sir." A silence that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but wasn't comfortable either. Santos, across the table, said quietly, "How long?" "Before the convoy moved," she said. He nodded slowly, touching the bandage above his eyebrow again without noticing. She sat in the equipment room afterward, alone with the rifle and the familiar process of cleaning something that was already clean. It was a habit she'd had for years, maintained through deployments and transfers and the particular accumulation of experiences that made habitual things feel necessary. The repetition was useful. It gave her hands something to do while her mind worked. She was thinking about the third shooter. The assessment at the debrief had categorized him as a retreating element, one individual, role-likely spotter or secondary support, who had withdrawn when the engagement turned. That assessment was probably correct, but probably correct and confirmed were different things, and she was not a person who settled for probably when she had access to more information. She turned to a fresh page in the notebook, started drawing the terrain from memory, the canyon, the ridgelines, the North Fold where she'd lost him, the geometry of the approach from the Highland Plateau. She'd read every available report on this sector before the deployment. 3 times, because the first read was for information, the second was for gaps, and the third was for the spaces between sentences where the actual picture lived. She knew things about this mountain that hadn't made it into the official threat assessment. She'd known them before today. Today had confirmed some of them and raised questions about others. Team Phantom was going back into this sector in 10 days. Different objective, different route, same general area, same mountain, same elevated terrain with the same geometry that someone, somewhere, had been studying as long as the task force had been operating here. She wrote. The rifle was clean. The notebook was filling. Outside, the wind was coming down from the Blackstone peaks in long, cold pulses. The same wind she'd read on that ledge for nearly an hour. The same wind that had shifted exactly when it needed to and moved the smoke exactly where it needed to go. She hadn't been lucky. She'd been prepared. Those were 2 different things, and the difference between them was everything she'd done in the years before today. But preparation wasn't enough on its own. You had to be in a position to use it. She underlined 2 sets of coordinates in the notebook. Cave positions, northeast aspect of the second ridgeline, discovered in a field survey note from 14 months ago that had been filed and never followed up on. She'd flagged them in a supplemental memo to Hayes 3 days ago, alongside 6 other items from her terrain analysis. He hadn't responded to the memo. She stared at the coordinates for a long moment. Then she turned to the next page and began writing the case for why those 2 positions needed to be addressed before the second operation. Clean, specific, unemotional. Not a complaint, not a challenge. Just a set of facts laid out in sequence, with range calculations and engagement geometry and the specific scenarios in which failing to account for them would produce a bad outcome. She wrote until the evidence was complete. Then she set down the pen, looked at what she'd written, and considered who was going to read it and what they were going to decide. The mountain didn't care what they decided. It would be the same mountain either way, vast, gray, cold, indifferent to the arguments of people who hadn't earned its attention. Emma had been earning it for a long time. She closed the notebook and sat in the quiet for a while, listening to the wind. Outside somewhere, Hayes was writing his own report. Somewhere, Morrow was finishing the accountability paperwork. Santos was probably still touching that bandage without knowing he was doing it. The third shooter was somewhere on this mountain or off it, and she didn't know which. There were 10 days until the next operation. She had a lot of work to do. The memo sat in Hayes' inbox for 4 days before he responded to it. Emma knew this because the base's internal communication system logged read receipts, and she checked the log each morning the way she checked the wind. Not obsessively, just consistently, because information was information regardless of whether you liked what it told you. The memo had been opened on day 4 at 21:43 hours, which meant he'd read it late, probably after the evening planning session, probably when the operations room had cleared out and he was working through the backlog of administrative items that accumulated around any active deployment like sediment around a riverbed. His response came the following morning at 06:11. 2 sentences. Noted. Terrain assessment will be incorporated into route planning at the appropriate stage. She read it twice. Set her coffee down. Read it once more. At the appropriate stage was not a timeline. It was a placeholder. It was the administrative equivalent of a hand raised in a meeting to indicate that you'd heard something without committing to doing anything about it. She wrote it in the notebook. Not the coordinates page. A separate page she'd started for the second operation, tracking what had been submitted, when, and what response it had generated. Documentation wasn't distrust. Documentation was evidence, and evidence was the only currency that held value when opinion and rank were the alternatives. She closed the notebook and went to find Morrow. He was in the equipment bay at 06:30, which was where he usually was in the mornings, running gear checks on the team's communications equipment with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who'd learned to trust his own preparation more than anyone else's sign-off. Morrow was 41 years old, which was old for the work, and he moved like someone who'd made peace with every year of it. There was a particular quality to people who had been doing dangerous things for a long time. They stopped wasting motion. Emma came in without announcing herself and sat on a crate across from him. He didn't look up from the radio he was testing. Carter. Morrow. She paused. I submitted a terrain assessment 3 days before the first operation. 2 sets of cave positions on the northeast aspect of the second ridgeline. Hayes acknowledged it this morning. Morrow set down the radio, picked up a different one, began checking the frequency seal. I know, I saw the memo. The response was a non-answer. Yeah. He turned a dial incrementally, listening to something she couldn't hear. It was. We've got 9 days. 8, he said. Planning cycle moves up tomorrow. Hayes pulled it forward. She hadn't known that. She absorbed it without showing that she hadn't known it. So route planning is happening now. Route planning is happening now, he confirmed. A pause. She watched him work. He was careful with equipment the same way she was careful with the rifle. Not performatively, just completely. You could tell a lot about a person from how they handled things when no one was testing them. The cave positions, she said. If we're routing through the second ridgeline approach, they cover the western flank for approximately 600 meters. That's not a coverage gap, that's an open corridor. Morrow finally looked at her. His expression was not unkind, but it was not encouraging either. It was the expression of a person who was about to say something pragmatic that they would prefer not to have to say. Carter, I understand what you're flagging. I read the memo. The detail work is solid. He set down the second radio. But you've been on this team for 3 weeks. Hayes has run 7 operations in this sector. His read on the threat picture carries weight that your read doesn't yet. That's just the math of where you're standing. The math of where I was standing got 2 shooters off the east wall and an RPG team neutralized. Yes, Morrow said. It did. He said it simply, without concession or emphasis. Just acknowledgement. And that's noted. But one engagement doesn't rebalance 3 weeks of institutional skepticism. That's also just the math. She didn't argue with it. He wasn't wrong about the math. She didn't have to like the math to recognize it. Is there a planning session I can be present for? She asked. Morrow picked up the third radio. Talk to Hayes. Hayes's office was a repurposed storage room that someone had furnished with a folding desk, 2 metal chairs, and a whiteboard that was perpetually covered in route geometries drawn in 3 different colors of marker. He was there when she knocked on the open door frame at 0800, on the phone with someone at the higher command net, and he held up one finger without looking at her. She waited in the doorway. The phone call took 6 minutes. She counted them. When he hung up, he looked at her with the expression of a man who had been expecting something and had decided to get it over with. Carter, come in. She came in, sat in one of the metal chairs without being asked, because waiting to be asked was a performance of deference she wasn't willing to give and he didn't actually need. The cave position's in the memo, she said. I read the memo. The planning cycle moved up. I want to know if those positions are going to be addressed in the route. Hayes leaned back slightly in his chair. He was not a man who showed frustration visibly. It surfaced instead as a kind of deliberate patience, a slowing of pace that was almost imperceptible unless you were watching for it. She was watching for it. The northeast aspect of the second ridgeline is outside our projected engagement area, he said. The operation is focused on the valley floor approach and the compound itself. We're not routing through terrain that puts us within range of those positions. The valley floor approach passes within 400 meters of the lower cave at the 14-month-old survey point. 400 meters is— I know what 400 meters is, Sergeant. Well within effective range for a crew-served weapon if they've had time to establish a stable position. Which they have. That survey is 14 months old. Hayes was quiet for a moment. The whiteboard behind him had the second operations route sketched in blue marker. A long sweeping approach from the northwest, cutting south along the valley floor, then pushing east toward the compound. She could see the gap between the route line and where the cave positions would be, and it was not 400 meters. It was closer to 350. She'd measured it from the satellite overlay that morning. Those positions were assessed as unoccupied at the time of the survey, Hayes said, 14 months ago, by a two-person element that spent 40 minutes on the northeast aspect before weather-forced withdrawal. That's in the survey report. She kept her voice level, not aggressive, just precise. 14 months is enough time to establish a position, cache supplies, and develop a rotation. If someone wanted a crew-served overwatch on the valley floor approach, those caves are exactly where they'd put it. Hayes looked at her for a moment that went on slightly longer than comfort allowed. Is that an assessment or a hypothesis? He asked. It's an assessment. I can walk you through the methodology if that's useful. Another pause. He picked up a pen, not to write anything, just to have something in his hand. I'll have Price look at the geometry, he said finally. If the numbers support the concern, we'll adjust the route. It was more than she'd gotten from the memo response. It wasn't a commitment, but it was a crack in the wall, and a crack in the wall was something to work with. Thank you, sir, she said. She stood to leave, got to the door. Carter. She stopped. The RPG call on the east wall. You said you'd been watching that position before the convoy moved. Yes, sir. How long before? She turned back. 47 minutes. He didn't say anything for a moment. She couldn't read what was happening in his face. It was the face of a man processing something that required more recalibration than he'd anticipated, but doing that processing very privately. Dismissed, he said. Not unkindly. She walked back out into the base corridor, into the cold air that always moved through those prefab corridors no matter how many times maintenance worked on the seals, and she thought about what 47 minutes meant and what Hayes was doing with the number right now. 47 minutes of watching before she'd ever touched the radio. 47 minutes of reading a position that SIGINT had cleared and the mission plan had ignored. In that time, she could have said something. She'd said what she was able to say, which was one transmission that had been shut down. After that, all she'd had was the rifle and what she'd already prepared for. Preparation was the part that people couldn't see. It happened before everything, in the hours and the days that looked like nothing from the outside. That was the thing about the work. The only part that was visible was the end of it. She found Price at 1100 in the operations room working through the route overlay on a digital mapping system. He was younger than Morrow by about 6 years and had the particular professional intensity of someone who'd come up through a different track, not quiet like Emma, not methodical like Morrow, but sharp in a way that sometimes cut sideways. She'd noticed early on that Price was the one on the team most likely to have an opinion out loud, and most likely to change that opinion without much ceremony if the facts moved. She set her notebook on the table beside his keyboard, open to the page with the cave coordinates and the range calculations. He glanced at it, then looked at it more carefully. Hayes sent you, he asked. Hayes said you'd look at the geometry. Yeah, he texted me 20 minutes ago. He turned the notebook slightly so the calculations were right side up for him, studied them. You did this from the satellite overlay? Satellite overlay and the original survey report. The survey has a rough elevation marker for the lower cave, Putz. I cross-referenced it against the terrain model and adjusted for the approach angle from the northwest. Price pulled up the terrain model on his screen, began entering numbers. The process took about 4 minutes, during which neither of them said anything. She watched the screen. He watched the numbers. 342 meters from the route line at the closest approach, he said. That's not 400. No. That's a problem. He sat back, looked at the screen for a moment. A crew-served weapon in the lower cave, established position, good sight lines. That's a problem. You're right about that. The upper cave covers the approach from the vehicle staging area. They work together if they're occupied by a coordinated element. Price looked at her. He had a direct way of looking at people that she'd initially read as hostility, but had since recategorized as simply his baseline. He looked at everything directly. It wasn't personal. How do you know they work together? He asked. The survey has compass bearings from each cave to the valley floor. I overlaid them. The coverage zones intersect for approximately 220 meters of the approach route, the section between the terrain fold and the compound perimeter. If you're in either cave, you see that whole stretch. If you're in both caves simultaneously, you have no gap. Price was quiet. That's thorough work, he said finally. It's basic geometry. Basic geometry that nobody else on this team did. He said it without particular inflection, but it landed anyway. He turned back to the screen. I'll flag it to Hayes with the numbers. Route adjustment is his call. She picked up the notebook. I know. Carter. She stopped. The first operation, the east wall call. He was still looking at the screen when he said it. I was in Vehicle 3. I didn't see the RPG position from where I was. I didn't even know it was there until your transmission. She waited. I should have said something at the debrief, he said. I didn't. I should have. She considered this for a moment. You didn't need to, she said. The record covered it. He nodded once, curtly, which seemed to be as much acknowledgement as he was comfortable offering. She left him to the numbers. Simon, the second operations planning session happened 3 days later, in the same operations room with the same dry erase markers and the same assembled team. The route had been adjusted, not dramatically. Hayes hadn't pulled the approach entirely from the valley floor because the valley floor was the only viable route to the compound, and everyone in the room knew that. But the adjustment put the convoy's closest approach to the cave system at 510 meters rather than 342, and it introduced a suppression contingency into the fire support plan that accounted for the possibility of crew-served fire from the northeast aspect. Hayes acknowledged the adjustment without attributing it to anyone. He presented it as a route refinement based on updated terrain analysis. The team accepted it the way experienced operators accepted most planning changes, with the understanding that the plan was always a starting point and the terrain would have final say anyway. Emma didn't say anything during the brief. She listened to every word and cross-referenced it against her own calculations in the notebook on her knee, checking for gaps and finding a few minor ones that she wrote down without bringing them up. Some things you flagged in the room. Some things you prepared for privately, because the room had a limited tolerance for input from people who hadn't yet established their credit. She was still building credit. She understood the economy of it, even if she didn't particularly enjoy it. Trust in closed professional environments accumulated differently than it did anywhere else. It didn't respond to credentials or performance summaries. It responded to time and consistency, and the accumulation of small moments where you'd been right and hadn't made anyone feel bad about it. You couldn't rush it. You could only keep working. After the planning session, Webb caught her in the corridor. He was 26, young for the team, and had the kind of compact, self-contained energy that sometimes came from being the newest and least senior person in a room for long enough that you'd learn to take up very little space. He'd been in the lead vehicle during the IED. She'd noticed he hadn't looked at her the same way since. Carter? He fell into step beside her without asking. The cave assessment, was that yours? She looked at him. Why? Because the route change is in the brief and nobody explained where it came from, and the only person on this team who's been flagging the northeast aspect is you. He said it matter-of-factly, not accusatorially. Price ran the geometry, she said. With whose numbers? She didn't answer that, and he took the non-answer for what it was. I'm just saying, he said. Good call. It's a route adjustment, she said. We don't know yet if it was needed. You think it is? I think it's better to find out from 500 meters than from 342. Webb thought about this for a moment. Yeah, he said. That's kind of the whole thing, isn't it? He peeled off toward the equipment bay. She continued to her room. That night, she couldn't sleep. This wasn't unusual. She had a complicated relationship with sleep that she'd had for most of her adult life, and she'd learned not to fight it. She lay on the cot in the small room she'd been assigned on the base's eastern wing, staring at the ceiling with the particular flat alertness that came when her mind was still moving, but her body had exhausted its reasons to. She was thinking about a man named Darren Cole. She didn't often let herself think about him deliberately. He came when he came, in the specific quality of silence before a shot, in the weight of a radio that wasn't answering, in the way certain combinations of cold air and high terrain assembled themselves into a landscape that felt familiar for reasons she couldn't justify from maps. Cole had been her partner for 2 years on the 114th, and then he had been dead for 4, and those two facts sat beside each other in her memory, without ever quite resolving into a shape she could look at directly. He'd been a better shot than her when they'd started working together. Not dramatically, not in every condition, but he had a natural steadiness that she'd had to build deliberately over years. She'd spent a long time trying to understand what made him that way, and had eventually concluded that he simply didn't carry his past into the scope the way most people did. He had some mechanism for compartmentalization that she'd never managed to replicate. He died because of a missed shot. Not his, someone else's. An Overwatch element that had been asked to cover a position at the edge of their effective range in conditions that made the shot marginal, and had taken it anyway, and had missed, and the miss had allowed a vehicle to move that shouldn't have moved, and the vehicle had done what vehicles with bad intent do when they move toward people and aren't stopped. She'd been 800 meters away. She'd seen it through the scope. She hadn't had the angle. She turned over on the cot, faced the wall, and let the thought settle into the particular place she kept it, which was not forgotten and not ignored but contained. Contained was the right word. A thing you didn't pretend wasn't there, but also didn't let loose to run through everything else. She had become the kind of sniper she was, the one who read wind patterns for 47 minutes before a convoy moved, the one who cross-referenced 14-month-old survey reports with satellite overlays, the one who filed memos that nobody acknowledged and filed them again anyway, because of a missed shot in a vehicle corridor on a different mountain in a different year. Not as punishment, not as some performance of guilt, but because the understanding of what a missed shot cost had reorganized her entire sense of what preparation meant. It meant everything. It meant the 47 minutes and the memos and the notebooks and the late nights with terrain models and the willingness to be the person in the room that nobody was comfortable with, because being uncomfortable was survivable and being unprepared was not. She lay still until her mind finally slowed, and then she slept. The next 6 days developed a pattern. She was present at every planning session Hayes ran, not intrusively. She sat where she was placed, spoke when she was asked, and otherwise made herself useful in the specific, unglamorous ways that attached personnel found to contribute when they were outside the core decision loop. She helped Webb run comms checks. She assisted Morrow with the vehicle route mapping. She spent 2 hours with Santos going over the compound's assessed layout, not because anyone had asked her to, but because Santos had been in the lead vehicle when it hit the IED. And he'd developed a particular interest in ground truth that she understood. Santos was 29 and from somewhere flat in the Midwest that he described with a specific kind of homesick amusement, the way people describe places they love and find slightly absurd at the same time. He wasn't an operator who had ever worked with a dedicated precision shooter before this deployment, and he had the practical curiosity about it that she'd found was common in people who learned through watching things work rather than through formal instruction. The 47 minutes, he said, on the third day, when they were bent over the compound layout together. He'd been circling around it for an hour. Before the convoy moved, you were watching a position you'd already flagged. Yes. And you knew, before the IED, before contact, you knew something was wrong. She considered how to answer this. I knew there was a probability, she said. I couldn't confirm until the light changed. But your gut was in that position. My gut was in that position because the geometry of the terrain and the intelligence gaps made it a logical location for an Overwatch element. It wasn't instinct. It was information. She paused. Instinct usually means you saw something you haven't processed yet. Santos thought about this. So it's always information, even when it feels like instinct. Usually, she said, the work is making sure there's enough information in there for the instinct to be right. He went quiet for a while after that, looking at the compound layout with a slightly different expression than before. On the fourth day, Hayes invited her to sit in on a secondary planning session that hadn't been on the team's shared calendar. She didn't ask why she was being included. She came, she listened, she contributed 3 observations about the approach route that were incorporated without comment into the adjusted plan. Morrow was present. He didn't acknowledge her contribution directly, but he wrote the route changes down without asking Hayes to repeat them, which was its own kind of signal. On the 5th day, someone had moved her gear into a better room on the base. Not a transfer order, not a formal reallocation, just moved. She found it arranged neatly on a cot in a room that got actual ventilation, which the eastern wing room she'd been in had not. She didn't ask who'd done it. On the 6th day, she was in the equipment bay running her own gear check when she overheard Morrow and Webb in the adjacent room through a wall with a ventilation gap that carried sound imperfectly but adequately. Not about the east wall anymore, Morrow was saying. It's the consistency. Every call. The math holds. You can't fake that. Webb said something she didn't catch. Morrow. 3 weeks and she's filed 2 terrain assessments, 1 post-operation supplemental, and a route geometry analysis. None of it was asked for. Webb, louder now, possibly closer to the vent. And Hayes? A pause. Hayes is updating the picture, Morrow said. It's just taking him longer than it should. She kept working. She had a suppressor to clean and a wind table to finish calculating for the valley floor approach under the expected morning conditions. The conversation on the other side of the wall wasn't hers to respond to. It was its own thing, developing at its own pace. 2 days before the second operation, she found Hayes at the whiteboard alone at 2200, working through something with the red marker. She'd come to return a terrain report she'd borrowed from the operations room filing cabinet, a survey from 8 months ago that covered the compound's water access, which she'd had a theory about and had wanted to confirm before she dismissed it. The theory had been wrong. The report had confirmed it was wrong, which was almost as useful. She was about to leave without disturbing him when he said, without turning, "What do you see wrong with this approach angle?" She stopped. He was pointing at the route on the whiteboard with the cap of the marker. The approach angle on the western side, curving south before pushing east toward the compound. She came into the room, looked at the whiteboard. The curve puts the lead element in a depression for approximately 90 meters, she said. Defilade from the compound, which is good, but also defilade from any support element behind the ridgeline. If something happens in that depression, the support element loses line of sight before they can reposition. Hayes looked at the whiteboard. That's the same thing I've been looking at for an hour. There's no clean fix if you're keeping the valley floor approach. You can time the lead element's transit through the depression to coincide with the support element repositioning on the ridgeline, but that's a sequencing problem. Adds complexity. Or you accept the gap and make sure whatever happens in the depression is handled by the lead element itself without expecting support to reacquire in time. She paused, which means the lead element needs to know about the gap before they enter it. Hayes was quiet. Brief it explicitly, she said. Name the depression. Name the gap. Make sure everyone who goes through it has already thought about what they'd do if contact happened there. He nodded slowly. Yeah. He wrote something on the whiteboard. Yeah, that's it. He turned the marker over in his hand a few times. She was about to leave again. The Northeast Cave Assessment, he said. The 14-month survey. You found that in the archive. Yes, sir. That archive has 3,000 documents in it. How long did you spend in there? She thought about it. Parts of 4 days, she said. There's a lot of material that's not indexed well. He looked at her for a moment. Not the evaluative look she'd become accustomed to, the one that was weighing her against some standard she hadn't been told about. Something slightly different, harder to name. Get some sleep, he said. 2 days out. Yes, sir. She left him with the whiteboard and walked back through the cold corridor with the terrain report under her arm, and she thought about the whiteboard and what he'd been looking at for an hour, and what he'd said when she'd answered the question he hadn't told her he was asking. That's it. 2 words again. Different 2 words. She filed them alongside everything else and went to prepare. She slept 4 hours and woke before the alarm. The 2 days had compressed the way time did before operations. Not quickly, exactly, but densely. each hour carrying more weight than the calendar suggested. She'd spent them finishing her wind tables for the valley floor approach, running the cave position calculations one final time against the updated satellite overlay Hayes had pulled from the command net, and sitting with the terrain model until she could close her eyes and walk every meter of the approach route in her head with the same clarity she'd walk a hallway she'd lived in for years. The morning of the operation arrived at 400, gray and cold, the kind of cold that had settled into the base's metal structures overnight and was going to take until noon to work its way out. She was already dressed when the wake call came through. She sat on the edge of the cot with the rifle across her knees and ran the function check by feel. In the dark, the way she always did before she left a room for somewhere the rifle would matter. Bolt carrier, gas key, extractor, ejector. Every component returning the right pressure to her thumb, the right sound to her ear. Nothing communicates a mechanical problem like silence, where there should be a click, or resistance where there should be none. Everything was right. She picked up the notebook. Read the wind tables one more time, set it down, left the room. The staging area was organized chaos at 0430. Vehicles running, operators moving through final equipment checks, the compressed radio traffic of a team verifying it was whole before it moved into terrain that would test whether whole was enough. Emma moved through it without hurrying, finding her position at the rear of the second vehicle where she'd been slotted in the movement order. Her sector for the operation was the northeast aspect, specifically the cave system and the elevated terrain above the valley floor approach, plus whatever secondary coverage gaps appeared as the mission developed. Hayes ran the final brief at 0445, standing on the hood of the lead vehicle with a headlamp and a map board. He'd lost the habit, somewhere in the last week, of looking at the team's center of mass when he spoke and avoiding the specific corner where Emma stood. She'd noticed the shift without drawing attention to it. He made eye contact with her twice during the brief, once when he named the depression in the western approach, and once when he referenced the cave positions and the suppression contingency. Both times he moved on immediately, which was exactly right. "Phantom rolls at 0500, he said. "Wraith, your overwatch position is the Sentinel." He used the call sign they'd assigned to the ridgeline above the valley's northern entrance. A position she'd identified and Hayes had approved, 840 meters from the compound perimeter and with direct sight lines to the cave system. "Established by 0530, we're not moving the convoy into the valley until you confirm eyes on northeast terrain. Any contact on the approach, you call it." "Copy," she said. "Anyone have something to add?" Nobody spoke. The cold moved through the staging area. "Mount up." The route to the Sentinel position branched from the convoy's path at the valley's north entrance, a 3-kilometer foot movement across rising terrain that she ran alone in the dark, which was the way she preferred it. The night vision was good, the terrain was consistent with what she'd memorized, and she moved without light at a pace calibrated to arrive with enough time to settle before Hayes needed her confirmed. She arrived at 0519 and spent 4 minutes clearing the position before she committed to it. She'd been trained to assume that a good position might already be occupied by someone who'd thought of it first. She'd been doing it long enough that the habit was automatic. A slow visual check, a pause to listen. A second visual check from a different angle before she put herself prone and became part of the landscape. The position was clear. She established the rifle on the bipod, adjusted her body angle for the slope, and began reading the northeast terrain while the sky above the Blackstone peaks shifted from black to the particular deep blue that preceded gray. The cave system was visible to the scope, not the cave mouths themselves, which were too recessed, but the terrain immediately below them, the approach ledges and the sight lines. She marked the angles, noted the wind, which was from the west this morning, not the northwest, logged it. At 0528, she keyed the radio. "Phantom, Wraith is established at Sentinel. Eyes on northeast terrain. Cave positions are cold. I have clear sight lines to both approach ledges." She paused. "Wind is west at 3.5. Confirm that before moving anything into the valley." Hayes acknowledged. She heard him relay the wind information to the vehicle commanders. At 0538, the convoy entered the valley. The valley floor approach was 3 kilometers of exposed ground. Not flat, because nothing in the Blackstones was actually flat, but comparatively open, the terrain dropping into a broad depression that narrowed progressively toward the compound perimeter. From the Sentinel, she could see the lead vehicle's roofline moving through the depression on the western approach, the one Hayes had been staring at for an hour 2 days ago with the red marker. It disappeared into the defilade the way she'd calculated it would, and for 40 seconds the lead element was invisible to her. She watched the northeast terrain during those 40 seconds. Nothing moved. The lead element emerged from the depression, and the convoy tightened its formation for the final push toward the compound perimeter. She heard the radio traffic in fragments, the lead vehicle calling distance markers, Morrow managing the breach element, Hayes coordinating from the second vehicle. Clean, professional. The machine of it was running well. She exhaled slowly and let her eye rest on the cave ledges. She wasn't sure what made her hold there instead of scanning wider. There was no movement, no sound that reached her at this distance, no single thing she could have named. But there was something about the texture of the lower ledge that was different from how it had looked at 0519. The shadow distribution was different, and the difference wasn't explained by the angle of the morning light, which had been gradually flattening as the sky brightened. She brought the magnification up. Rock. Loose debris. The ledge was a rough natural shelf of granite maybe 3 meters deep and 4 meters wide, tucked below the actual cave mouth. It looked exactly like it was supposed to look, except the debris pattern on the left side had changed. A scattering of small stones that had been toward the rear of the ledge at 0519 was now concentrated toward the front edge. You didn't overthink these moments. You acted or you didn't, and the action was always the same. You reported what you'd observed, and you stated what it meant. Phantom, Wraith, lower cave ledge, northeast aspect. Debris pattern has shifted since my initial assessment. Possible contact, stand by. Hayes' response was immediate. What kind of shift? Consistent with someone moving across the ledge from the rear to the front. I don't have eyes on an individual, but the pattern is inconsistent with wind or natural cause. Wind is cross-slope from the west. Debris moved front to rear on the ledge would be wind. Debris moved rear to front is something else. A beat. Can you confirm visual on a person? Negative, not yet. Convoy is committed to the approach. 3 minutes to the breach point. She knew what 3 minutes meant. She didn't answer it directly. She kept the scope on the lower ledge and watched. 50 seconds later, a hand appeared at the left edge of the ledge. Just a hand extending to brace against the rock face, the arm attached to it barely visible behind the granite. Then the arm withdrew. A classic adjustment movement. Someone shifting their position, checking their angle. Not yet in full setup, but close. Phantom, Wraith. Confirmed individual at lower cave ledge, single person, not yet in firing position. He's establishing. Can you engage? The range was 912 meters. Morning light, flat and diffuse. West wind, steady at 3.5, possibly gusting to 4 to 5 on the ledge itself, given the terrain funnel between the cave walls. She'd have to account for the updraft off the valley floor as the air warmed. The target was partially concealed and moving intermittently. She could engage. The question was whether she could engage in a way that was clean at this range, in these conditions, against a partially visible target. Working on it, she said. This was not a comfortable answer to give over radio to a commander with a convoy 3 minutes from a breach point and a gunman setting up above the approach route, but it was the accurate answer. A confident false answer would have been worse. She made 2 small adjustments to her position, body angle, breath alignment, and watched the lower ledge. The individual moved again. This time, more of him became visible. A shoulder, the top of a head, and below it, emerging from the shadow at the rear of the ledge, cave mouth, the front end of something long and dark, that the angle and the light resolved into a bipod-mounted tube. Crew served. Probably an RPG variant or a recoilless rifle. She couldn't confirm from this angle, and it didn't matter which. Either one would penetrate armored vehicle roofing at this elevation and this range. Phantom, Wraith, crew-served weapon establishing at lower cave. He has angle on the convoy in approximately 90 seconds. I need clearance. Hayes, are you confident in the shot? This was the question. Not a bureaucratic question. It was a real one. He was asking her to assess herself honestly, in real time, under conditions that mattered. The same question she'd been building toward answering for 3 weeks, and before that for 4 years, and before that for the entirety of her professional life. She was 912 meters out. The wind was real, but she knew it. The light was flat, but she'd been reading it since before dawn. The target was intermittent, but the position was fixed. "Yes," she said. "Cleared to engage." She fired on her next full exhale. The round traveled 912 meters in just over a second. In that second, she was aware of nothing except the scope and the position of the weapon on the ledge and the specific point of the rock face where the bipod's right leg was anchored. Not the man, not the tube, but the structural support of the setup. The point that if removed would collapse the angle and buy time for the convoy to move through the exposure window. The round struck the bipod support precisely where she'd aimed. The weapon shifted violently to the left, the barrel swinging off angle. The figure behind it dropped flat. "Not hit," she noted immediately, taking cover. And the weapon went with him into the rear shadow of the ledge. "Phantom Wraith, weapon displaced. Operator has gone to ground. He's not eliminated, but he's not in position. Move the convoy through the exposure window now." "Moving?" Hayes' voice clipped. She was already scanning for the upper cave, because if there was one, there was almost certainly two. She'd calculated the coverage zones herself. She'd shown Price the overlap. She knew what coordinated looked like on paper, and she was now seeing what it looked like in practice. The lower cave hadn't been alone. The lower cave had been the one that moved and gave itself away. The upper cave was the one that had stayed still. Upper cave, northeast aspect, approximately 40 meters above and 60 meters east of the lower position. She'd ranged it twice from this position during her initial setup. 981 meters. The cave mouth was larger, the ledge wider, the sight lines better, which meant whoever was up there had chosen the better position and was less likely to move unnecessarily. She scanned the upper ledge. Nothing visible. Nothing visible was not nothing. Nothing visible was someone good enough to be invisible. "Phantom, Wraith. Upper cave position may be active. I don't have visual confirmation, but if lower cave is occupied, upper is likely coordinated. Do not slow the convoy in the exposure window." "We're through the first exposure window," Morrow said. "Moving to breach point. 90 seconds." She watched the upper cave, watched the texture of the shadow inside the mouth, the distribution of loose stone on the ledge, the quality of stillness. Some stillness was absence. Some stillness was presence controlled with very good discipline. The stillness had weight. At 72 seconds before breach, she saw it. Not movement, but the cessation of something that had been so small and so constant that she hadn't registered it as movement at all until it stopped. A slight, rhythmic variation in the shadow distribution inside the cave mouth. The breathing pattern of someone lying very still. It stopped when the person shifted their grip, and the shadow pattern changed by a fraction of a degree. She had the position now. She couldn't see the weapon. She could see where the weapon had to be based on the body orientation that the shadow implied. She could calculate the angle from that position to the convoy's current location in the approach corridor. She keyed the radio. "Upper cave is active. I have an estimated position. No visual on weapon. Breach element is about to enter the upper cave's primary coverage zone." "How confident?" Hayes asked. 70% on position, 90% on activity. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "Engage at your discretion," Hayes said. "Don't wait for certainty." That was different from everything that had come before it. Engage at your discretion was not a checkbox. It was a transfer of trust. She took it the only way it could be taken, seriously and without hesitation. She fired into the estimated position, 2 rounds in sequence, adjusting for the angle differential between the estimated body location and the estimated weapon location. Neither shot was aimed at a confirmed visual. Both were aimed at geometry, at the place the math said the threat was, based on shadow and inference, and 981 meters of cold morning air. The cave mouth erupted. Not an explosion, a discharge. Something in the upper cave discharged into the roof of the cave mouth rather than the valley floor. The muzzle flash visible for a quarter second before the smoke obscured it. Whatever weapon had been up there had fired uncontrolled, the round going into rock rather than into the convoy below. She heard the radio traffic shift immediately. "Contact. Upper cave discharged. No impact on convoy. Breach element is clear. Moving to compound." "Wraith, what happened up there?" Morrow, voice fast. "I disrupted the firing position," she said. I don't have confirmed elimination. Someone may still be in that cave. Watch your exfil route. Copy. She kept the scope on the upper cave. The smoke was thinning in the west wind. The lower cave ledge was still empty. Whoever she'd displaced down there had not reappeared. The upper cave was dark and still again, but a different kind of still now. She noted the time. 6:21. Below, the breach element hit the compound perimeter. She held the sentinel position for the next 38 minutes while the breach played out in radio fragments. The compound wasn't large, 4 structures, confirmed occupancy of 7 to 11 individuals based on pre-mission surveillance, and the breach element was 8 operators who'd rehearsed the entry sequence until it ran on its own logic. She heard it in the cadence of the radio traffic, the calls coming faster, then a gap, then the measured voice of someone doing a building-by-building clearance, then Morrow calling secure. She kept watching the cave system. At 0641, a figure appeared at the lower cave ledge. She identified him in 2 seconds. Same clothing pattern, same body type as the individual she'd displaced. He was moving east along the ledge, away from the damaged bipod position, clearly looking for an exit route rather than a firing solution. He wasn't raising a weapon, he was leaving. She tracked him. The shot was available. 870 meters, moving target, clear visual. She had the wind, she had the range, she had the angle. She did not fire. She keyed the radio. Phantom, Wraith. Single individual exiting lower cave, moving east along the ledge toward the north trail. No weapon visible. Exiting, not re-engaging. Recommend intercept if you have an element. Hayes. No element available for intercept. Can you contain? Contain. An interesting word for what he was asking. He's moving away from the convoy route, she said. He's not a current threat to the operation. If I fire on an individual who isn't actively raising a weapon, that's a different decision than engagement in self-defense or defense of the convoy. A pause. Your call, Wraith, Hayes said. She tracked the figure until he cleared the north end of the ledge and disappeared into the terrain feature behind it. She noted his direction of travel, his approximate pace, and the likely intersection point if a ground element were to move toward intercept in the next 15 minutes. She did not fire. Some decisions were about capability, some were about judgment. She'd learned a long time ago that the second mattered more than the first, and that the people who never chose not to shoot were usually people whose judgment eventually cost someone something irreplaceable. She reported the direction of travel, the intersection estimate, and her decision rationale in one transmission, clearly and without apology. Hayes said, logged, good call. She didn't know how he meant that. She decided it didn't particularly matter. The extraction began at 0704 and ran to 0731, the convoy reversing out of the compound approach in the reverse of the order it had entered. Rear vehicle first, lead vehicle last. She covered the extraction from the Sentinel, shifting her focus from the cave system to the valley approach as the convoy moved back through the exposure window and the depression. The lower cave stayed empty. The upper cave stayed dark. The lead vehicle was through the depression at 0728. She broke down the position at 0733, the same methodical sequence as always. Bipod folded, scope covers on. The notebook went into the chest pocket. She stood up from the rock. Her legs had been in the same position for 2 hours and 14 minutes, and the cold had gotten into the joints the way it always did, and the first few steps hurt in the particular dull way that had nothing to do with injury and everything to do with duration. She began the 3-kilometer movement back to the valley entrance. The debrief was at 1100. The compound had yielded a significant cache: weapons, communications equipment, documentation that the intelligence element was already working through. 2 individuals had been detained during the breach. No casualties on the team. One operator, Webb, had taken a fragment from a misdirected round during the breach and had been evaluated at the base medical station, where Corman had pulled a small piece of metal from his forearm and declared him functional. Webb was at the debrief with his left arm bandaged and an expression that communicated he was going to be fine and would like to stop being asked about it. Hayes ran the debrief himself. He went through the sequence in order, the way he always did. The convoy movement, the approach, the breach, the clearance, the extraction. He was precise and objective, neither inflating the success nor minimizing the difficulty. When he reached the cave system engagement, he paused. The northeast cave positions, he said. Lower cave was occupied by at least one individual with a crew-served weapon. Upper cave was occupied by at least one individual with an unknown long weapon. He looked at the assembled team. Both positions were flagged in a terrain assessment submitted prior to this operation. The route adjustment that put us at 500 meters rather than 342 was a direct result of that assessment. He paused again. That assessment was Sergeant Carter's. The room was quiet. It was a different quiet than the quiet after her first mission engagement call. That quiet had been uncertainty, people recalibrating a picture they'd been comfortable with. This quiet was something else. More settled. Like something that had been developing for 3 weeks had just completed a step that couldn't be undone. Morrow, across the table, was looking at the map and not at anyone in particular, which was how he registered most things. Santos was looking at her, not the calculating look from the first debrief, something more straightforward than that. Price said, "The upper cave shot. You fired on an estimated position with no confirmed visual. 70% confidence. That's a tight call." "Yes," she said. "Walk us through it." She walked them through it. The shadow variation, the breathing pattern inference, the body orientation calculation, and the angle to the convoy. The decision to fire before certainty, because certainty was going to arrive at the same time as the weapon discharge, which was the moment after which walking through the decision was going to be academic. When she finished, Price nodded once. "The lower cave decision," Hayes said. "The individual exiting. You chose not to engage." "He wasn't raising a weapon," she said. "He was leaving. The convoy was out of his effective range within 90 seconds regardless. The risk calculus didn't support the shot." "A lot of people would have taken it," Hayes said. "I know." She met his eyes. "That doesn't make it right." Hayes looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to the room and said something she hadn't fully expected, even after the last 3 weeks of incremental shifts. He said it in the same even, professional voice he used for all debrief conclusions, which made it more meaningful rather than less. Sergeant Carter's assessment of the Northeast terrain was accurate, thorough, and delivered in time for this team to act on it. The route adjustment it generated directly reduced our exposure in the approach window. The cave engagements she executed extended that protection through the breach and extraction. He set down the pen he'd been holding. This team's habits are going to need to update. When Carter flags something, it goes into planning. That's not a request. Morrow finally looked up from the map. Webb, across the table, said nothing. He was looking at his bandaged arm. She didn't say anything either. There was nothing to say that the record hadn't already said better. Later, she was in the equipment room, breaking down the rifle. Cleaning it with the methodical care that had been hers for so long, it was almost involuntary. The room was empty except for her, and the base had settled into the particular quiet of a mid-afternoon after a successful operation. The tension released, people sleeping or eating or doing the small mundane things that lives consisted of between the moments that mattered. She was on the barrel, third pass, left to right, when she heard boots in the corridor. She recognized Morrow's walk before he appeared in the doorway. He had a particular way of moving that was almost silent, but not quite, deliberate at every step. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "The upper cave shot," he said. 70%. "Yes." "I've seen people pass on shots with better odds than that." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. She kept cleaning the barrel. "Why didn't you?" he asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She set down the cleaning rod. Thought about how to answer it honestly without giving him more than the question required. "Because the math said the threat was there," she said. "And the convoy was 30 seconds from the worst of the exposure window. If I waited for visual confirmation, I was waiting until the situation had already decided for me." She picked up the rod again. "I'd rather be wrong at 70% and learn from it than right at 0% and not have the option." Morrow stood in the doorway for another moment. "The third shooter," he said. "From the first operation. You flagged a possible intercept estimate in the debrief. North trail bearing approximately 40 degrees from the lower cave exit point. We ran a patrol there this morning. Found a position, cold by hours but recently occupied." He paused. 3 people from the equipment sign." She absorbed this. "So he wasn't alone," she said. "No." Morrow's voice was even. "He wasn't." She looked at the barrel in her hands. Thought about what 3 people at a position on the North Trail meant, and what they'd been doing there, and how long they'd been doing it, and what they'd been watching. That's going to need to go into Hayes's threat assessment before the next operation, she said. Yeah, Morrow said. It is. A pause. He already knows. He asked me to tell you. She set the barrel down. Hayes had asked Morrow to tell her, not sent a memo with a 2-sentence response, not acknowledged it at the appropriate stage. Had asked Morrow, specifically Morrow, who was the person on this team she'd been navigating around carefully for 3 weeks, to walk to this room and deliver the information directly. She turned that over for a moment. Okay, she said. Morrow nodded once. He left without saying anything else, his boots quiet in the corridor until they weren't. She picked up the barrel and finished the third pass. 3 people at a position on the north trail. She sat with that for the rest of the evening, the rifle cleaned and reassembled and set aside, the notebook open to a fresh page. She wrote the coordinates Morrow had given her, approximate since he'd described the location verbally rather than with a grid reference, and she'd converted the description to coordinates using the terrain model she'd memorized. She wrote the bearing from the lower cave exit point. She wrote the estimated time the position had been occupied, working backward from Morrow's description of the equipment sign and the patrol's arrival time. The numbers produced a picture she didn't like. 3 people at a static observation position on the north trail above the valley entrance with line of sight to the Sentinel Ridgeline. They'd been there before the operation began, before the convoy staged, possibly before she'd established her overwatch position, which meant they'd been watching the approaches to the valley before Team Phantom had moved anything into the operational area. They hadn't been a response to the operation. They'd been anticipating it. She wrote that down in plain language. No hedging, no probability qualifiers, because this wasn't a hypothesis anymore. This was a conclusion supported by evidence that could be laid out in sequence for anyone willing to follow it. Then she wrote the question that followed from the conclusion. How long had they been anticipating it, and what had they communicated to whom, and where were they now? She was still writing at 2300 when her door opened without a knock, and Hayes stood in the frame with his jacket on and his expression carrying something she hadn't seen on him before. Not urgency, not concern, but the tight-faced quality of someone managing information that had just upgraded in significance. We need to talk, he said. Or might. He took her to the operations room, which was empty at this hour. The whiteboard still had the valley floor approach on it, the route lines from the second operation, the adjustment she'd recommended marked in a different color. He didn't look at it. He sat in the chair at the head of the planning table and put a tablet on the surface between them. On the tablet was a signals intelligence report, time-stamped 14 hours ago. She read it. It was 2 pages. The relevant section was in the middle of page 1, flagged in a different font from the surrounding text. Communications intercept, Northeastern Highland sector, confirming coordination between at least 2 separate elements in the region. The intercepted traffic referenced an overwatch team, 3 individuals, the report confirmed, and referenced a target description that matched the convoy's movement profile from the second operation. The intercept had been collected and processed by the higher command net and had reached Hayes's inbox 40 minutes ago. She set the tablet down. They knew the convoy was coming, she said. The intercept doesn't confirm when they acquired that knowledge, but the position on the North Trail was established before our staging time. I calculated pre-dawn establishment based on Morrow's patrol assessment. The intelligence element ran the same calculation independently. They agree. Hayes leaned back in his chair. He had his arms crossed, not defensively, but in the particular way that people hold themselves when they're thinking through something they haven't finished. This changes the threat picture for the sector. Yes, she said. The third operation is in 12 days. Compound 2, northeast approach. The third operation. She'd known it was in the planning cycle. It had been mentioned in passing during the second operation brief, but she hadn't seen any specifics. She looked at Hayes. He was looking at her in a way that communicated he'd brought her here specifically, to this room, at this hour, for a reason that went beyond sharing intelligence. What do you need from me? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Everything, he said. Every terrain assessment you've been holding back because you didn't think I'd read it. She looked at him steadily. I haven't been holding anything back. Everything you've been filing in that notebook instead of submitting because the first 2 memos got non-answers. A pause. That's more accurate, she said. He didn't apologize for the non-answers. She hadn't expected him to. What he did instead was push the tablet toward her and say, "Write it up, all of it. Full terrain analysis for the northeast approach. Every flag you've identified, every gap in the current threat picture. I want it on the planning table before the cycle starts." She put her hand on the tablet. "All of it," he said again. "Don't edit for what you think I'll accept." She took the tablet. She worked until 400 and produced 11 pages. It was not the most elegant document she'd ever written. She was running on 5 hours of sleep distributed across 2 days, and at certain points the sentences were leaner than they should have been, stripped to their functional components without the surrounding context that made them easier to absorb for someone without her background. She flagged those sections and added footnotes with the source references she was drawing from. The footnotes made the document longer, but also made it something that could be checked, which was more important than length. She sent it to Hayes at 04:07 and went to sleep. He responded at 08:12 while she was eating breakfast alone in the mess hall. The response was 9 sentences. It acknowledged receipt. It noted 3 specific sections where he was requesting additional detail: the northeast approach angles, the vehicle staging exposure window, and a paragraph she'd written about the likely communication structure between the cave system and the North Trail observation position. It asked her to be available at 1400 for a planning session that would include the full team and the attached intelligence officer. It was not a non-answer. She ate the rest of her breakfast and went to find the additional source material. The intelligence officer was a captain named Delaney, who'd been on the base for the duration of the deployment in a role that intersected with Hayes's planning at specific intervals but operated largely separately. Emma had seen him in corridors and in the mess hall, but hadn't worked directly with him. He was in his mid-30s, compact, with the particular analytical stillness of someone whose professional value lived entirely in what he knew rather than what he could do physically. He and Hayes had a working relationship that had its own rhythm, the mild friction of 2 professionals who respected each other without particularly enjoying each other. At 1400, the planning room had Hayes, Delaney, Morrow, Price, and Emma. The rest of the team wasn't present. This was a different kind of session than the full mission briefs, smaller, more specific, the kind where the planning actually happened as opposed to where completed planning was transmitted. Delaney had the signals intelligence report on a laptop and a second document she hadn't seen before. A collation of intercepts across the previous 3 months, the full picture of communications activity in the Highland sector. He walked through it without preamble. "The network we're looking at is not a static defensive structure," he said. "It has multiple mobile elements, at least 3 fixed observation posts we've confirmed and 2 we've inferred, and a communication pattern that suggests coordination between positions rather than a single command point. They're watching approaches, not just defending compounds." Morrow said, "The Compound 2 operation, northeast approach. What's their coverage on that route?" Delaney pulled up a coverage map. Current confirmed coverage takes the northeast approach from the valley entrance to approximately 800 meters from the compound perimeter. After that, there's a gap. He pointed to the gap on the map, a terrain fold that created a blind zone, roughly 300 meters deep. The compound itself is covered by internal security, but the approach is watched from the outside. "And the gap?" Price asked. "The gap is a terrain product. It's not designed. If they wanted to eliminate it, they'd need a position on the southern fold, which is exposed and would require regular resupply." Delaney looked at the map. "My assessment is they've accepted the gap because it's manageable. Once something enters the gap, it's 300 meters from the compound. At that point, internal security takes over." Hayes said, "Carter." She looked up from the document she'd been cross-referencing. "The northeast approach in your analysis. Walk us through the gap." She stood up, moved to the map. She'd been in this position before. In the first briefing, 3 weeks ago, when she'd flagged the east wall positions, and the room had been quiet in the way that meant unwilling, not uncertain. This was a different quiet. This one was paying attention. "The gap corresponds to this terrain fold," she said, pointing to the same feature Delaney had identified. "From a sniper overwatch position on the southern ridge, here, you have line of sight into the gap for its full depth. A support element in that position during the approach would cover the 300 meters where the external network loses visibility and the internal security hasn't yet engaged. She moved her finger. The problem is the southern ridge is exposed on its western face. Getting an overwatch element there requires coming up from the eastern approach, which adds approximately 2 kilometers to the movement and passes within range of the confirmed observation post at grid. I know that grid, Delaney said. He was looking at her with a particular kind of attention. That observation post hasn't been kinetically addressed because we haven't had a clean opportunity. It's a clean opportunity if you have an overwatch element moving to the southern ridge and you sequence the movement to address the observation post en route. She looked at the map. Range from the eastern approach to the observation post is approximately 700 meters. Manageable. Price said, "That's your position." "That's the position," she said. Not deflecting, not modest, just accurate. The room was quiet again. Hayes was looking at the map with the expression she'd seen at the whiteboard at 2200 2 nights ago, working through something not yet finished. "Delaney," he said. "The observation post at that grid. What's the current assessed occupancy?" 2 to 3 individuals rotated on a pattern we haven't fully mapped, probably 48-hour cycles based on the intercept pattern. "So they're there," Hayes said. "Yes," Delaney said. Hayes looked at Emma. "If the observation post is occupied and alerted during your movement to the southern ridge, what happens to the operation?" This was the right question. She'd been sitting with it since she'd written the 11 pages. If they're alerted before I establish on the southern ridge, they have time to communicate the approach to the compound. Internal security goes active early. The breach element hits a prepared position instead of a transitional one. She kept her voice even. "If I establish on the southern ridge without alerting the observation post, I can address it at the moment it becomes operationally relevant, which is when the convoy enters the approach, not before. Before that, addressing it prematurely signals the operation." "So the sequence is everything," Morrow said. "The sequence is everything," she confirmed. "And your confidence on the movement?" Hayes asked. "In darkness, with an 8-hour window, using the eastern approach below the observation post sightline, set high. The terrain supports it. I ran the movement geometry last night." Morrow looked at Hayes. Something passed between them that was wordless but legible. The particular exchange of 2 people who have worked together long enough that significant things can happen without language. Hayes turned back to the map. "Build it into the plan," he said to Price. "Full detail. Carter briefs the movement sequence at the mission brief." Price wrote something in his notebook. Delaney was still watching her. He said quietly, not to the room, but to her directly, "The analysis you sent Hayes this morning. The 11 pages. A pause. "Where did you get the survey data on the Northeast Observation Network? That's not in any field report I have access to." She looked at him. "Archive. 14-month survey, partially completed due to weather, filed under geological assessment rather than tactical reconnaissance. It was misfiled. You found a misfiled 14-month tactical survey in an archive with 3,000 documents. The indexing is inconsistent," she said. "If you search by date range and cross-reference with grid quadrant, the misfiled reports surface." Delaney was quiet for a moment. "How long did that take you?" he asked. "Parts of 4 days," she said, which was the same answer she'd given Hayes when he'd asked the same question. Delaney looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at the map. Nobody said anything for a moment. The mission brief for the third operation was 6 days later. In between, Emma ran the movement geometry 4 more times on paper, ran it once on the terrain model in the operations room at 0200 when no one was there, and spent 2 evenings with Delaney going through the signals intelligence archive, looking for anything that bore on the northeast approach or the compound 2 internal security pattern. Delaney was not easy to work with. He was precise in the particular way of someone who'd built his entire professional identity on the quality of his analysis, which meant he pushed back on everything, not aggressively, but systematically, testing every conclusion for the weakest point before accepting it. She found she didn't mind. Being pushed was useful. It found the places where she was assuming something she hadn't confirmed, and those places needed to be found before the operation rather than during it. On the 3rd evening, he said, without looking up from the laptop, "The 114th, before you came here." She'd been expecting this at some point. Not from Hayes. Hayes had the information he needed about her professionally and hadn't indicated interest in more. But Delaney was an intelligence officer, and intelligence officers eventually got curious about the things that weren't in the file they'd been given. "What about it?" she said. "The restructuring, the investigations." He was still looking at the laptop. "You had 3 years with that unit before the disbanding. Before that, 2 years with the 82nd's long-range surveillance element, which is a selective assignment." He paused. "Before that is where the file gets interesting." "What does the file say?" "Not much. Cross-attached to a joint task force in an unspecified capacity for 18 months. Assessment report at the end of that period is classified above my clearance. The rating system it uses isn't a standard performance rubric." He finally looked up. "I've only seen that rating system in 3 other service records. 2 of those people are running programs I'm not cleared for." She held his gaze, said nothing. "I'm not asking you to confirm anything," he said. "I'm telling you what the file says, because you should probably know what people with the right clearances can see when they look at your record." "Why are you telling me?" He closed the laptop. "Because Hayes asked me to look at your file 3 days ago, and what I found was considerably more substantive than a political placement." He said it without editorial inflection, just the flat delivery of a fact. "And I thought you should know he knows that now." She looked at the closed laptop, at the table surface, at the particular grain of the prefab material that constituted every surface on this base. "The Joint Task Force attachment," she said finally. "I can't discuss the specifics. What I can tell you is that the skill set you've been watching for the last 3 weeks is not something I developed on ranges with the 114th. "No," Delaney said. "It isn't." He stood up, gathered his materials. "I'm going to recommend to Hayes that the Overwatch element for the 3rd operation is a permanent structural addition to the team's planning framework rather than an attached role. That's my recommendation." His decision. He left. She sat with that for a while. The mission brief was at 0600, full team present plus Delaney. Hayes ran it differently than the previous 2. Not in structure, but in orientation. The previous briefs had been presentations. This one had more the quality of a working session, with questions expected and a planning logic that was transparent rather than delivered complete. She noticed the difference and thought it probably meant something beyond the 3rd operation. When Hayes reached the Overwatch movement plan, he handed the floor to her without transition, just a single nod in her direction. She stood at the map board and walked the team through it. The eastern approach route in darkness, the 8-hour window, the observation post address sequence, when to engage and why, and critically why not to engage earlier, even if the opportunity was present. The southern ridge position and its coverage of the gap. The sight lines from that position to the compound approach corridor, and what she could and couldn't cover from there. Nobody interrupted. Nobody exchanged the careful sideways glances that had characterized the first mission brief 3 weeks ago. Morrow asked 2 technical questions, both of which were good. The kind of questions that tested the load-bearing elements of the plan rather than its surface. She answered them directly. Webb asked about contingency if the observation post was vacated between her departure and her arrival at the southern ridge. What did the plan look like if the threat she was planning to address wasn't there when she expected it? "If the observation post is empty when I pass it, the convoy approach is cleaner than planned," she said. "I continue to the southern ridge and cover the gap without the sequencing constraint. Better outcome, not worse." "And if it's more occupied than assessed," Webb pressed, "not 2 to 3, 5 or 6. Then I'm looking at a different engagement profile and I communicate that to Hayes before committing." She looked at him. 5 or 6 people at that position changes the risk calculation for the movement and potentially for the operation. That gets called in, not managed individually. Webb nodded. Santos, beside him, wrote something in his notebook. Hayes closed the brief at 0720. As the team filtered out, he said, "Carter, a minute." She waited while the room emptied. Morrow was the last to leave, and he glanced at her as he went. Not significantly, just the acknowledgement of someone who knew she was being kept back and didn't find it remarkable. Hayes stood at the map board. He had the marker in his hand again, the same habit from the whiteboard sessions, something to hold while he thought. "Delaney briefed me on what he found in your file," he said. "I know. He told me." A pause. Hayes turned the marker over once. "The Joint Task Force attachment, 18 months. Yes. I'm not going to ask you what that involved. I wouldn't be able to answer. I know. He set the marker down on the tray beneath the board. What I want to know is this. The 114th disbanding, the investigation, whatever happened there, did it affect your ability to do this job? She looked at him. It was a direct question and it deserved a direct answer. And the direct answer wasn't simple. No, she said, not the way you mean. The 114th investigation didn't touch my work or my record. I was cleared at every stage. What it did was end a unit I'd been part of for 3 years and scatter the people I'd worked with. She paused. That affects things. It affects how you trust new teams, how long you hold back before you commit to a structure. It affects some things. Hayes was quiet. It hasn't affected the work, she said. It never affects the work. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the sense that he was cross-referencing this against something. Against the 3 weeks he'd watched her, or against the file Delaney had shown him, or against his own experience of people who'd been through institutional disruptions and come out either diminished or clarified. The recommendation for the third operation, he said, Overwatch as a permanent structural element rather than attached. Delaney mentioned it. It's not Delaney's call to make. He picked up the marker again. I'm making it. You're not attached after this operation. You're on the team. She absorbed this without changing her expression. That's your call, sir, she said. Yes, he said. It is. He turned back to the map board. We're done. She walked to the door. Carter. She stopped. The North Trail position. 3 people. The intercept that matched the convoy profile. He hadn't turned around. That was you. You called the direction of travel and gave Morrow the intercept estimate in the same transmission as the no-shoot decision. Yes. Most people in that situation are focused on the decision they just made. They're not simultaneously calculating intercept windows. She didn't respond immediately. Thought about what he was actually asking, which wasn't a question about tactics. I've had a long time to practice doing more than one thing at once, she said. He nodded at the map board. She left. The third operation launched at 0300. Emma's movement to the southern ridge began at 1900 the night before, which gave her an 8-hour window before the convoy staged. She moved alone, in darkness, with night vision, and a pace she'd calculated to place her below the observation post's line of sight during the critical approach window. The terrain was consistent with the models she'd memorized. The eastern approach was steeper than the map suggested. It always was. Maps always flattened the vertical. But manageable. She passed below the observation post at 0112. It was occupied. She could hear faintly the sound of movement above. Not voices, just the small sounds of people maintaining a static position. A shift of weight. Something set down on stone. She kept her pace exactly calibrated, her movement absorbed into the ambient sound of wind across rock, and she did not look up. The observation post could not address the operation until the operation was visible. The operation was not visible until 0300. She did not need to address the observation post until that moment, and addressing it before that moment would announce the operation's existence to whatever communication structure the occupants were part of. She held the discipline for 47 meters below the post. Then she was past it, and the terrain opened ahead of her toward the southern ridge. She established on the southern ridge at 0218, cleared the position in 3 minutes, set up the rifle on the bipod, adjusted the angle for the gap below, and began reading the darkness. At 0250, she transmitted, Phantom, Wraith is established at Sierra. Gap is clear. Observation post is active. Occupied, 2 to 3 individuals, consistent with assessment. Ready to address on your call. Hayes. Copy Wraith. Convoy stages at 0300. Address the observation post at 0315 unless activity indicates earlier. Copy. She watched the dark and read the wind and let her breathing slow into the rhythm that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite wakefulness. At 0314, the observation post went active in a way that wasn't consistent with routine static watch. The sound changed. More movement, more frequency. The quality of people responding to something they'd just perceived. She didn't know what they'd perceived. It might have been the convoy's engine noise carrying farther than expected. It might have been a comms trigger from a different position. It didn't matter what it was. Phantom Wraith, observation post has gone active. Addressing now. Do not wait on my call to move. She heard Hayes relay the order to the convoy. She fired twice. Fast. because the window was closing. Two individuals who had moved to the ledge edge, both acquiring weapons toward the valley. The first shot was clean, the second was marginal, the target moving as she fired, and she knew before she confirmed through the scope that the second shot had been a hit, but not a clean one. She recalibrated immediately. Post addressed, 2 engaged. Second engagement was marginal. Assume 1 still mobile, moving north on the post's exit trail. Morrow, we have a containment element on the north trail, past the movement estimate. She calculated the exit trail bearing from the post's position, the terrain features that would funnel movement north, the likely pace. She passed it. Morrow acknowledged. Below her, in the gap, the convoy's lead element was moving. She watched it through the scope. Not the compound yet, not the breach, just the 300 meters of ground that had no coverage from either the external network or the internal security. Her ground. Her 300 meters. They moved through it clean. She exhaled. The breach on Compound 2 lasted 19 minutes. She covered the gap for all 19 of them, watching the approach corridor while the radio traffic told her what she couldn't see. The entry, the clearance, the rooms in sequence, the moment Morrow called structure secure. 2 detainees, documentation, a communication setup that Delaney was going to spend considerable time working through. At 0441, the convoy began extraction. The second individual from the observation post, the one she'd hit marginally, was confirmed by Morrow's containment element at 0417, 200 meters up the north trail. She noted the confirmation without ceremony. The shot had been marginal. The outcome had been adequate. She would go back through the engagement in detail later, find the specific error in the firing solution, and correct it. She broke down the southern ridge position at 0502. The sky above the Blackstone Peaks was beginning to shift from black to deep blue, the same color it had been on the first operation when she'd been watching an east wall position that Sigint had told Hayes wasn't there. She walked back through the dark on the same route she'd come, below the now empty observation post, and thought about what 9 weeks in this mountain had built, and what it had cost, and what the record now said that it hadn't said before. She was not the same person who had arrived at Iron Ridge Base with a transfer order and a service record that someone had found convenient. She was not different either. She was the same, but the distance between what she was and what this team could now see had collapsed. That was the thing about preparation. Eventually it became visible. Not because you made it visible, but because the situations that required it kept arriving, and each time one arrived, it left evidence. She arrived at the valley entrance as the first gray light reached the peaks above. The convoy was already staged for the return movement. She saw Hayes at the lead vehicle, radio in hand, and he looked up when she came down the final slope. Their eyes met across the staging area. He gave her a single nod. She returned it. The convoy moved. The convoy reached Iron Ridge Base at 0647. She rode in the second vehicle, which was where she'd been placed for the return movement, and she spent most of the drive watching the terrain recede through the window. The valley floor giving way to the Highland Approach Road, the road giving way to the base perimeter, the perimeter opening into the familiar arrangement of prefab structures and vehicle bays, and the particular quality of flat artificial light that made every military base on Earth look like every other one at this hour. She was tired in a way that had a specific texture, not the sharp exhaustion of a body pushed past its limit, but the settled, dull weight of sustained concentration over a long window. Her eyes ached faintly from the night vision. Her left knee had stiffened during the ridge movement and hadn't fully released. She'd been awake for 23 hours. She noted all of this without particular interest and got out of the vehicle when it stopped. Equipment check first, then the rifle, then the debrief. That was always the order. The debrief was at 0900 after the team had eaten and the medical check had cleared everyone, including the confirmation that Webb's arm from the previous operation was healing correctly, which Webb received with the same expression he applied to most things involving his own condition, which was mild irritation at being assessed. Hayes ran it the same way he'd run the second operation debrief. Precise, sequenced, giving the floor where appropriate. When he reached the Overwatch element's engagement at the observation post, he gave the floor to Emma without preamble. She walked through it. The approach. The timing discipline below the post. The establishment on the southern ridge. The moment the post went active at 0314, and the decision to engage without waiting for the 0315 call-out. The post went active at 0314, Morrow said. 1 minute early. What triggered the change? I don't know precisely, she said. My best assessment is engine sound from the convoy staging. Noise travels differently in that terrain at night than during the day. Or a comms trigger from a position outside my awareness. Either way, the activity pattern changed from static watch to acquisition, which made the timing irrelevant. The post had to be addressed before the convoy was visible. And the second shot, Hayes said. She'd known this was coming. Marginal, she said. The target moved mid-cycle. I adjusted the firing solution, but not completely. The hit was sufficient to prevent engagement, but it wasn't clean. She paused. I'll run the engagement back through the numbers and find where the solution broke down. There was an error in my wind read at that range and angle. I need to correct it. Price said the outcome was adequate. The outcome was adequate, she agreed. The shot wasn't. Those are two different things. A small silence. Morrow said, that's an honest assessment. It's the accurate one. Hayes looked at her for a moment, then moved on to the breach element's entry sequence. She sat down, opened the notebook, and wrote the time and range and conditions of the second observation post shot in precise detail while the rest of the debrief continued around her. She would reconstruct the firing solution tonight, when she wasn't running on 23 hours and the knee wasn't distracting her with its dull insistence. At the end of the debrief, Hayes said, 3 operations, 3 successful outcomes, no friendly casualties. He looked around the room. That record is the result of this team operating correctly, every element of it. He didn't look specifically at Emma when he said it, which was exactly right. He looked at the room. Dismissed. She slept for 11 hours. When she woke, it was late afternoon and the base was in the specific quiet of a post-operation day. The operational tempo dropped, people moving at normal pace, the particular social loosening that happened when a team had done the hard thing and come back whole. She lay on the cot for a while without moving, staring at the ceiling the way she had on the night she'd been thinking about Cole. And she thought about the 11 pages she'd written and the planning sessions and the whiteboard at 2,200 and the 47 minutes on the granite ledge before the first operation, and what all of it added up to from this particular vantage point. It added up to the same thing it always added up to. The work. Just the work. Accumulated. She got up, went to the mess hall, ate something unremarkable, and sat by herself for a while, and then Santos appeared across the table without asking, which had become his habit over the past several weeks. You look terrible, he said. 11 hours of sleep, she said. And before that? 23 awake. He nodded, satisfied that the math explained the appearance. He ate something for a while without saying anything. Santos had gotten better at comfortable silence over the course of the deployment, which she thought was probably a function of spending time around her, since she produced a lot of it. The Southern Ridge, he said eventually. Yes. 8 hours alone up there before we moved. 7 hours and 44 minutes from establishment to convoy staging. He looked at her. What do you do for 7 hours and 44 minutes on a ridge in the dark? She thought about this honestly. Read the wind, she said. Run the numbers again. Watch the terrain for anything that changed since the assessment. A pause. Think about other things. What other things? She looked at her food. Things. He accepted this. Morrow told me about the North Trail position after the second operation. 3 people. Yes. He said you called the intercept estimate in the same transmission as the no-shoot decision. It was the logical next step from the no-shoot. Santos was quiet for a moment. He had a way of pausing before he said things that he'd been thinking about for a while, not for dramatic effect, just because he was genuinely working through the phrasing. Before this deployment, he said, I thought Overwatch was basically someone on a hill watching. I knew it was technical. I didn't understand the scale of what you're actually doing up there. She looked at him. You're running about 15 different calculations simultaneously, he said. Wind, range, target, movement, communication, decision logic, contingency. And you're doing all of it alone, in the dark, for hours. And then you're expected to execute at the end of it like you just arrived. That's accurate, she said. How do you not burn out? She considered this. It was a genuine question and it deserved a genuine answer, not a professional one. You find the parts that feel like they're worth it, she said. Not the shot, the preparation. The moment when all the hours of reading and calculating actually produce the right answer. That part. She paused. The shot is just evidence that the preparation worked. Santos nodded slowly. Cole, he said. She went still. He hadn't looked away from her. He wasn't being unkind about it. He had the careful directness of someone who'd decided that dancing around something was less respectful than naming it. Morrow mentioned a name, he said. In passing, he wasn't explaining anything, but I know what it means when someone says a name that way. She held his gaze, said nothing for a moment. Partner, she said finally. 114th, 4 years ago. I'm sorry. Yes. She looked at the table. He was better than me at the time, the stillness. I had to build what he had naturally. She was quiet. That's why I build it the way I do. The 47 minutes, the 7 hours and 44 minutes. All of it. Santos sat with that. He'd have been good here, she said. Not regret, just fact. Yeah, Santos said, without knowing Cole at all, because the word fit regardless. They sat in the quiet for a while. Outside, the highland wind was doing what it always did, moving across the base structures in long pulses that found every gap and moved through it. Delaney found her 2 days later. He came to the equipment room, which had become something of a default location for conversations that needed to happen without the operations room's formal quality. He had a folder in his hand, physical, paper, which meant it was something he'd printed specifically rather than shared digitally. The communication set up from Compound 2, he said, sitting across from her without being invited. We finished the initial analysis. She set down the cleaning rod. And? It's more significant than the pre-mission assessment indicated. He opened the folder. The setup was a relay node, not a terminal point. Whatever was coming in and going out of Compound 2 was being passed to at least 2 other locations in the sector. One of those locations is Compound 3. She'd known there was a Compound 3 in the planning cycle. She hadn't been briefed on it yet. She waited. Compound 3 is the regional command point for the network we've been working against in the Blackstones, Delaney said. Whoever is running Compound 3 has visibility over the entire observation network, the courier routes, and the cache system. Taking Compound 3 doesn't just disrupt the network, it effectively ends it in this sector. Where is it? He turned the folder to face her. A satellite overlay. Recent. She could tell from the snow distribution on the ridge lines, which matched current conditions. The compound was on the far side of the northeastern ridge, in a valley she'd seen on maps but hadn't assessed in detail because it had been outside the operational area of the first 3 operations. She looked at it, estimated the approach geometries from what she could see, began calculating. Hayes has been read in, Delaney said. Command is giving this operation priority. It'll be planned as a full-team operation with additional assets. He paused. They're also attaching a second intelligence element and a command-level observer. She looked up from the overlay. An observer? A colonel, Delaney said. Colonel Nadia Voss. Special Operations Command. She's been tracking the network disruption operations in this sector, and she's coming to observe Compound 3 in person. He held her gaze. She requested a full accounting of the Overwatch element's role in the first 3 operations as part of her pre-mission briefing. Emma was quiet for a moment. She saw the reports? She asked. She read everything? The 11 pages. The original terrain assessments. The post-operation engagement analyses, including your self-assessment of the marginal second shot at the observation post. Delaney closed the folder. She asked Hayes specifically about you. By name. She absorbed this without showing what it did to her interior, which was something between recognition and something she didn't have a clean word for. The specific sensation of being seen by someone with the standing to see you after a long time of being looked past by people who had standing and chose not to use it. What did Hayes say? She asked. Delaney smiled slightly. It was the first time she'd seen him do that. It changed his face considerably. He said, and I'm quoting because it was a good sentence, she finds things in terrain that the people before her missed, and then she makes sure she's the reason those things don't cost us anything. He stood up. Voss arrives in 4 days. The Compound 3 planning session starts the day after. He left with the folder. She picked up the cleaning rod and sat with it for a moment without moving. Hayes had said that. Not in a debrief, not in an official report. In a conversation with a colonel from Special Operations Command who had been asking about her. He'd said it the way people say things when they mean them, not when they're constructing a professional account. She went back to cleaning the rifle. Colonel Nadia Voss arrived on a Thursday morning in a vehicle that was understated for someone of her rank, which Emma noted as a deliberate choice rather than an oversight. She was 52, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular economy of movement that came from decades of operating in environments where efficiency was survival. She wore no rank insignia on her field jacket. She moved through the base without announcing herself, which had the paradoxical effect of making her instantly visible to everyone who understood what they were looking at. Emma was in the operations room working through the Compound 3 terrain analysis when Voss walked in. Hayes was beside her. He'd been observing Emma's work for the last hour with the particular quality of a commander who'd stopped needing to direct and had started simply watching how the work got done. When Voss entered, he straightened without quite coming to attention. "Colonel." "Hayes." She looked at the map board, then at Emma. "Sergeant Carter." "Colonel." Voss came to the map board. She studied the terrain overlay for a long moment without asking for explanation, which was its own form of fluency. She was reading it rather than waiting to be told what to see. Emma watched her eyes move across the northeast ridge, the valley on the far side, the Compound 3 position. "The approach?" Voss said. "Western or eastern?" Emma pointed. "Eastern approach, same corridor as the observation post movement from the third operation. The western approach has 300 meters of exposed ground with no natural cover and 2 identified sight lines from the compound perimeter. The eastern approach is longer but adds terrain masking for the final 500 meters. And Overwatch? Northern Ridge here." She pointed to a position she'd identified the previous day. 1,100 meters from the compound, long shot under ideal conditions, extended at the boundary of reliable engagement under field conditions. She paused. "I'd want 2 days on the ridge before the operation. 1 to survey, 1 to settle." Voss looked at her. 2 days alone on a ridge." "Yes, ma'am." "Why 2? "Because the first day is information gathering. Wind patterns, thermal variations, terrain behavior. The second day is when I stop gathering and start knowing." She kept her voice level. "There's a difference between data and understanding. The second day produces understanding." Voss was quiet for a moment. "Hayes," she said without looking away from Emma. "Step out." Hayes stepped out without a word, which said something about Voss's standing that even Hayes's practiced authority acknowledged without friction. When the door closed, Voss turned to face her fully. "The Joint Task Force attachment," she said. 18 months. The classified rating." Emma said nothing. "I have the clearance," Voss said simply. "I read your complete file 2 days ago." "Then you know more about that period than I'm in a position to discuss," Emma said. "I know what you did during those 18 months, Voss said. "I know the conditions you were operating in and the assessments that came out of that period. I also know why the 114th disbanded and why your name wasn't in any of the associated reporting." Emma's expression didn't change, but something shifted very slightly in the set of her jaw, the particular muscular tension of someone holding a door that has been held for a long time and has gotten heavy. "What I'm trying to understand," Voss said, "is how someone with that record ends up as an attached Overwatch element on a task force that treated her like an administrative inconvenience for 3 weeks. Emma looked at the map board for a moment. "Force restructuring," she said. "My file was submitted with the 114th's disbanding paperwork. The classification on the task force attachment means whoever processed my posting didn't have visibility on it. They saw the 114th in a service record and treated it as routine." She paused. "And Hayes saw an attached sergeant and made an assessment based on how attached personnel usually arrive. And you let that run." "I wasn't in a position to correct it," Emma said. "You don't walk into a new team and hand them your classified record and say, 'You should treat me differently.' You work. You wait for the record to build itself in a context they can see." She met Voss's eyes. "That's what I did." Voss looked at her for a long moment. "The 11 pages you submitted to Hayes for the third operation planning cycle," she said. "The terrain analysis. I read it 3 times. Emma waited. "The methodology is not something you learn in a standard reconnaissance curriculum," Voss said. "It's not something you learn in the 114th's training pipeline either. The way you read the misfiled survey, the way you cross-reference the intercept pattern against the terrain model, that's a specific analytical framework." She paused. "I've only seen it used by 2 other people in my career. Both of them came out of the same joint task force you were attached to. The room was quiet. I'm not asking you to confirm it, Voss said. I'm telling you that it's visible, to the right eyes. She turned back to the map board. The Compound 3 operation. I want the full Overwatch plan in writing by tomorrow morning, not the summary. The full plan. Every calculation, every contingency, every decision point, and the logic that drives it. Yes, ma'am. And Carter? Voss didn't look at her. She was studying the northern ridge position Emma had identified. After Compound 3, we're going to have a different conversation. Not here. At command level. She touched the ridge on the map with one finger. There are places in this organization that need what you do and don't have it. That's a problem I'm in a position to address. Emma absorbed this without expression. I'll have the full plan ready by 0600, she said. Voss nodded once. Emma left the room. Hayes was in the corridor. He'd been standing exactly far enough from the door that he couldn't have heard anything through it, which meant he'd chosen the distance deliberately. He looked at her as she came out. Well, he said, she wants the full Overwatch plan by tomorrow morning. He looked at her for a moment. That's not what I meant. She looked back at him. I know. He waited. She has my complete file, Emma said. She understands the picture. Hayes was quiet for a moment, processing this in the particular way he processed things that required him to revise a prior understanding. Not defensively, but completely, one layer at a time. The Joint Task Force attachment, he said. It's significant. Yes. Significantly more significant than a political placement. She held his gaze. Yes. He let out a slow breath. Not embarrassment, exactly. Something more complicated than that. The particular discomfort of a person who is honest enough to fully reckon with what they got wrong rather than minimizing it. I called it in the motor pool, he said. 3 weeks ago. Morrow and Price. I heard. He looked at her steadily. I owe you a straight acknowledgement of that. You don't owe me anything, she said. The record corrected it. The record corrected it because you worked to correct it when you had every reason to do otherwise. He said it without deflection. That's not nothing, Carter. That's not a small thing. She looked at the corridor wall, at the prefab surface with its institutional paint and its institutional lighting and its complete lack of anything that would make it distinguishable from 1,000 other corridors and 1,000 other bases. I know what it is, she said finally. The Compound 3 operation launched 14 days later. Emma spent 2 days on the northern ridge. The first day she surveyed, wind patterns, thermal rise off the valley floor, the micro-terrain variations that altered bullet trajectory in ways that the satellite overlay didn't capture. She filled 6 pages of the notebook. She ate protein bars and drank from a 2-liter bladder and moved no more than was necessary. The second day she knew. She'd explained the difference to Santos. This was what it felt like from the inside. The shift from processing to understanding, when the terrain stopped being a problem to be solved and became a language she could read. The wind off the north face came in 3 distinct patterns depending on the time of day. The valley floor produced a thermal updraft between 0900 and 1100 that altered the effective range calculation by a margin that wasn't large but wasn't ignorable. The compound perimeter had 2 vehicle positions that weren't visible in the satellite imagery but were detectable from the shadow patterns at dawn. She wrote all of it, sent it to Hayes and Delaney at 1800 on the second day, 14 pages this time, because the terrain was more complex and the operation was more significant, and she wasn't editing for what she thought they'd accept. Hayes acknowledged within 20 minutes. The acknowledgement was 3 sentences. This is the best pre-mission terrain analysis I've seen in 11 years of command. Route adjusted for vehicle shadow position. Brief tomorrow at 0600. She read it once. Set down the radio. Watched the valley go dark. The Compound 3 operation ran for 4 hours and 11 minutes. It did not go cleanly. No operation of this complexity ever did. The convoy entered the valley on the eastern approach at 0445 and encountered an additional guard post at the 600-meter mark that the pre-mission surveillance had not identified. The guard post had 2 individuals and they were alert, possibly triggered by the observation post disruption from the 3rd operation. Possibly on a rotation that had simply placed them there that morning by coincidence. The reason didn't matter. What mattered was that the convoy had to stop, and stopping in the approach corridor with the compound 300 meters away was not a sustainable position. Emma addressed both individuals at the guard post from 1,120 meters in conditions that were not ideal. The thermal updraft had started early, 40 minutes earlier than her survey window suggested, which meant the morning air was doing something she hadn't fully accounted for. The first shot was clean. The second required a 3-second recalculation because the thermal was affecting the final 200 meters of the trajectory in a way she'd underestimated. She fired the second shot. It was marginal. Better than the observation post shot in the third operation, worse than she wanted. The guard post was neutralized. The convoy moved. She noted the thermal discrepancy in the notebook in real time, not because there was anything to be done about it now, but because the next person who stood on this ridge deserved to know it. The breach was harder than the Compound 2 operation. Compound 3 had more occupants than assessed. 11 confirmed rather than the 7 to 9 that Delaney's intelligence had estimated. The breach element was in the structures for 26 minutes, which was 7 minutes longer than the operation plan allowed for. During those 26 minutes, she covered the approach corridor and the vehicle positions and a secondary exit route on the eastern face of the compound that nobody had asked her to cover, but that represented the obvious choice for anyone trying to leave. At minute 19, someone tried the secondary exit. She'd been watching it for 26 minutes. She had the range, 830 meters, the wind, and the angle. The individual who came through the exit was armed, moving fast, heading for the vehicle position she'd identified from the shadow patterns. She fired once. The individual went down. The vehicle stayed where it was. At minute 26, Morrow called structure secure. 7 individuals detained. Significant cash. The communications equipment that Delaney had been anticipating. The network hub that connected to the broader structure across the sector. The extraction was clean. The debrief for Compound 3 happened at Iron Ridge Base with Colonel Voss present. She sat at the back of the room and said nothing while Hayes ran the full sequence. When Hayes reached the Overwatch element, he gave Emma the floor the way he always did now. Without ceremony, without explanation, just the nod that meant, "This is yours." She walked through it. The 2-day survey, the thermal discrepancy and the real-time adjustment, the guard post engagement, the 26 minutes of coverage during the breach, the secondary exit call. When she finished, Voss spoke for the first time. "The thermal discrepancy," she said. "You noted it in real time." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Emma looked at her. "Because whoever stands on that ridge next needs to know about it." The room was quiet in the particular way it had learned to be quiet. Voss looked at her for a moment, then nodded once and said nothing more. Hayes completed the debrief. When he dismissed the team, he said, "Compound 3 is the operational conclusion of the Blackstone Highlands series. The network in this sector has been effectively disrupted. That outcome is the product of 11 weeks of work by this team, conducted in conditions that tested every element of our planning and execution." He looked around the room. "The record of this deployment will be submitted to command as a complete package. That record includes every terrain assessment, every engagement analysis, and every planning adjustment made during the series. All of it." He paused. "All of it." The room understood what he meant. She was in the equipment room for the last time that evening, cleaning the rifle, when Hayes appeared in the doorway. He did that now, appeared in doorways and waited, which was different from the first week when he'd come through doorways already talking. "Voss wants a meeting at command level in 10 days, he said. "She's submitting a recommendation for a standing Overwatch role at task force level. Permanent assignment, not attached." He paused. "It would be a different job. More planning, more mobility, different teams on rotation." She set down the cleaning rod. "What do you think?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I think you've spent 11 weeks proving that the reason this team succeeded is partially because of what you brought to it. I also think the work you do is valuable beyond one team." He paused. "I think you should take the meeting." "And this team?" Something shifted in his expression. Not sentiment, exactly. He wasn't a sentimental person. Something more honest than sentiment. "We'll rebuild," he said. "We'll find a good sniper. We'll spend 6 months figuring out that they're not you." He said it without irony. "That's how it works." She looked at the rifle in her hands, at the cleaning rod on the table beside it, at the notebook closed, with 11 weeks of calculations and terrain notes and wind tables inside it. I'll take the meeting, she said. Hayes nodded. Carter, she looked up. The motor pool? 3 weeks into deployment. He held her gaze. I got it wrong. Not about your capability. I didn't have information about your capability, about my methodology. I made a call based on how someone arrived rather than what they did. He kept his voice even. He'd clearly thought about how to say this and had decided that plain was better than elaborate. That's on me, and it won't happen again with anyone who serves under my command. That's something you changed. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said, not dismissive, not gracious, just accurate. He left. She finished cleaning the rifle, assembled it in the dark by feel the way she always did, and sat in the quiet room while the Highland wind moved through the base structures outside. Morrow found her at the vehicle bay the next morning, the last morning before the deployment rotation ended and the team dispersed for reassignment processing. He was loading equipment into a case with the same unhurried care he applied to everything. She was doing the same. They worked in silence for a while. The first operation debrief, he said eventually. When Hayes said the route failure would be documented. Yes, I should have backed that up in the room. He kept loading equipment. I had the same read on the east wall positions when I went back through your pre-mission report. I didn't say so in the debrief. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Institutional weight, he said. Hayes had run 7 operations in that sector. You'd been on the team for 3 weeks. The math of it made me hold back. He looked at her. That was wrong. She looked at him. Morrow, she said. You told Webb and Santos about Cole. He looked at her steadily. I mentioned a name, yes. Why? He thought about it honestly. Because they were trying to understand what they were seeing and they didn't have the context. And because I thought you'd want them to understand it the right way rather than speculate. He paused. I should have asked you first. She considered this. It's fine, she said. He deserves to be known. Morrow nodded once. They finished loading in silence. When the cases were closed, he picked his up and stood for a moment. You're good at this, he said. It was not an elaborate statement. It was the statement of someone for whom understatement was a form of precision, and who had never said this to her before, and who was saying it now because the 11 weeks had accumulated into something that made not saying it feel dishonest. I know, she said. He almost smiled. Yeah, he said. You do. He walked out with the case. She stood at the vehicle bay entrance for a while after he left, looking at the Blackstone Highlands on the horizon. The peaks were clear in the morning light, the snow visible on the upper ridgelines, the gray stone below it catching the early sun in a way that made the whole range look both magnificent and indifferent, which was exactly what it was. She thought about this granite ledge and the 47 minutes. She thought about the 11 pages and the whiteboard at 2,200 and the 2-day ridge survey and 14 pages this time. She thought about a missed shot on a different mountain 4 years ago and the man who had died because of it and the thousands of hours between that day and this one, the hours that nobody saw and nobody counted except her. She thought about Santos asking what you do for 7 hours and 44 minutes on a ridge in the dark, and the answer she'd given him, which was true but incomplete. What you did was build something. You built it hour by hour in conditions that didn't care whether you were there or not. You built it alone, in the dark, in the cold, without audience or acknowledgement, because the building itself was the thing, not the recognition of it, not the moment when someone finally looked at what you'd constructed and said, correctly, that it was good. Those moments mattered. She wasn't going to pretend they didn't, but they weren't the reason. The reason was standing on a ridge at 4 in the morning and knowing, with the certainty that only comes from accumulated preparation, that when the moment arrived, she would be ready for it. Not because she was exceptional, because she'd refused to be unprepared. The Blackstone peaks didn't move. The wind came off them in long, cold pulses, the same wind she'd been reading for 11 weeks. And she read it one more time out of habit. Northwest, 4 miles per hour, steady, before she picked up her case and turned away. The mountains receded behind her as she walked. She did not look back. What you build in the hours no one sees is what holds when everything else fails. The work is its own answer. The preparation is its own purpose. And the person who refuses to be dismissed by silence, who keeps preparing in the dark without applause or permission, that person doesn't just survive the moment. They become the reason others do.